Barry Mannakee died on the 5th of May 1987, 6 weeks after he was quietly removed from Princess Diana's protection detail. He was 39 years old. He left no memoir. He gave no interviews. He had spent 2 years as Diana's personal bodyguard, present in every private hour the official schedule did not record. Inside every room, the cameras never reached. Diana believed he was killed because of what he knew. She said so on tape. 4 years after his death, speaking alone into a recorder in a room at Kensington Palace, she described what she thought had happened to him in words that have been in the public record ever since. She believed the institution had arranged it. She believed the transfer and the death were a sequence, not a coincidence. She believed someone had decided that the man who had spent 2 years standing beside her through the worst years of her life now knew too much to be allowed to keep knowing it. The official investigation found no evidence that she was right, but the investigation examined only one question, whether the death was deliberate. It did not examine the other question, the one this account addresses, which is what died with him regardless of how the dying happened. Barry Mannakee was inside Diana's private life, across the years of the marriage's worst deterioration, in the continuous proximity of someone whose job required him to be present in every space she occupied at every hour of the day and night. He was also, by Diana's own account on those tapes, someone she trusted in the specific personal way that she trusted almost nobody else in those years. She talked to him. She told him the truth about what her life actually contained, in a period when the truth and the official version had nothing to do with each other. When he died, that truth died with him. This account assembles what it can of what he knew. It is assembled from what survived. He took the rest to his grave. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The protection role has a specific requirement that distinguishes it from every other professional relationship that exists in close physical proximity to another person. A doctor examines a patient and leaves. A private secretary attends meetings and manages correspondence from an office adjacent to the principal's. A lady-in-waiting accompanies the principal at public engagements and withdraws at the appropriate point. All of these roles produce knowledge of the person they attend to, knowledge that is specific and personal, and that the professional relationship's confidentiality requirements are designed to contain. None of them produce the specific kind of knowledge that the protection role produces, because none of them require the sustained physical presence across the full range of a person's daily existence that the protection work demands. A protection officer does not examine and leave. A protection officer stays. The staying is the operational requirement, because the threat that the protection is designed to address does not confine itself to the scheduled hours of the principal's public engagements. The threat is a permanent condition of the principal's existence rather than an occasional dimension of it, and the protection that addresses the threat must therefore be as permanent as the threat itself. The officer who goes home at the end of the working day and returns in the morning leaves a gap in the protection that the threat does not leave in its attention to the principal. The protection cannot leave gaps that the threat does not leave, which means the protection must be as continuous as the threat, which means the officers providing the protection must be present across the full range of hours that the principal's daily existence covers. For Diana, Princess of Wales, in the years between her marriage in July 1981 and the formal separation in December 1992, the full range of hours that her daily existence covered was a range that the official schedule captured in its public dimension, and that the protection arrangements covered in its private dimension. The official schedule produced the photographs and the news coverage and the managed presentations of the princess at the events the palace had organized and approved and briefed the press about. The protection arrangements covered what happened between the events, in the residences, and the cars, and the corridors, and the private hours that the official schedule did not record, and that the press photographers did not capture, because they were not there. The protection officers were there. They were there because the threat that required their presence was not a threat that respected the boundary between the official schedule's hours and the private hours the official schedule did not cover. The threat was present in the private hours as well as in the public ones, which required relationships in the years of the marriage and the post-separation period, were relationships conducted over lines that the protection officers were aware of, because the protection role's communication security requirements placed the officers in relationship to the principal's communications, in ways that the ordinary observer of the public marriage was not in. They knew who was calling and at what hours, and with what frequency, not because they were eavesdropping in the deliberate sense, but because the operational environment of the protection work placed them in the physical spaces where the calls were made and received, and where the call's basic parameters were observable facts of the environment the officers were managing. The specific telephone relationships that the protection officers' proximity made observable to them were relationships that the press would eventually pursue through other means, and that the official accounts of Diana's life would eventually address in the terms those accounts found appropriate. James Hewitt was a relationship that Diana disclosed on the Morton tapes and that the press coverage of the years following the tape's release addressed in extensive detail. The protection officers who were with Diana across the years of the Hewitt relationship were with her in the proximity that the relationship's existence and its conduct produced as observable facts of the environment they were managing. They knew about the relationship not because Diana told them directly, though Diana's relationship with some of her protection officers was sufficiently trusting that direct disclosure was not outside the range of what the relationship permitted. They knew because the protection role's sustained presence made the relationship's existence an observable feature of the daily environment, in the specific way that sustained presence makes observable the features of an environment that the environment's occupant might prefer to keep private, but cannot keep private from the people whose job requires them to be present in the environment continuously. The observability is the specific quality of the protection officer's knowledge that distinguishes it from the knowledge of every other professional whose access to Diana's private life was significant but bounded. The journalist who received a briefing from Diana knew what Diana chose to disclose in the briefing. The biographer who assembled an account of Diana's life knew what the sources the biographer interviewed were willing to say in the interview. The therapist who worked with Diana knew what Diana disclosed in the therapeutic context. Each of these forms of knowledge was shaped by the mediating factor of the disclosure decision, the decision made by the person who controlled what information was shared and in what form it was shared. The protection officer's knowledge was not shaped by the mediating factor of Diana's disclosure decision in the same way. It was shaped by the operational requirement of continuous presence, which placed the officers in the environment where the knowledge was being produced by Diana's actual existence, rather than by Diana's decision to share selected elements of that existence with selected people for selected purposes. They knew what they saw, they knew what they heard, they knew what the environment's observable conditions made available to someone in continuous presence within it. The continuous presence produced, across the months and years of an assignment, an accumulated understanding of the principle that exceeded what any bounded professional relationship could produce, because the bounded professional relationship's access was bounded, and the protection relationship's access was not bounded in the same way. The doctor's knowledge of Diana was bounded by the examination's duration and by the specific medical questions the examination was designed to address. The protection officer's knowledge of Diana was bounded only by what the sustained presence in the full range of her daily environment made available to someone paying the professional attention to that environment that the protection role required. That attention was not the attention of someone deliberately accumulating personal information about the principal for purposes other than the protection work. The attention was the professional attention of someone whose job required them to be present and aware and ready to intervene in the full range of the principal's daily environment. The personal information that the attention produced was a byproduct of the professional requirement rather than the purpose of it, and the byproduct accumulated across months and years of continuous service into a body of personal knowledge about the principle that the protection officer carried as the accumulated product of having done the job well for a sustained period. Diana understood this. The people who have written most carefully about her relationship with the protection arrangements around her describe a woman who was acutely aware of what the protection role's continuous presence meant for the privacy of her daily existence, and who managed the awareness in a specific way that reflected her understanding of the situation. She could not remove the protection. The protection was not optional. The threat that required the protection's presence was real and was not reducible by her preference for privacy, and the institutional machinery that managed the protection arrangements was not organized to accommodate the principal's preference for privacy in the private hours to a degree that compromised the protection's effectiveness. What she could do, and what the accounts of the officers who served with her consistently describe her as doing, was decide what to do with the knowledge that the protection role's presence was inevitably producing. The decision was not the decision of someone who had calculated the strategic implications of the protection officer's accumulated knowledge and was managing those implications through a deliberate program of relationship management. It was the decision of a person who was lonely in a specific and acute way, and who found in the protection officers, in at least some of the protection officers across the years of the different assignments, a form of human presence that the institutional environment around her was otherwise failing to provide. The loneliness was the specific loneliness of someone inside an institution that was organized around the management of her public presentation and was not organized around attending to her private needs. The palace's resources for Diana's private needs were the resources that the institution's understanding of what the principal required made available, which were the resources of the official household's management, of the domestic staff, and the ladies-in-waiting, and the officials and the advisors, whose roles were defined by the institution's requirements, rather than by Diana's personal experience of what she needed. What she needed, in the period of the marriage's worst years, was human contact that was not organized around institutional performance. She needed people who were willing to be present with her in her actual condition, rather than in the condition the institution required her to present. She needed someone who would listen to what was actually happening to her, rather than managing the communication of what was happening into a form the institution could work with. She found it, at least partially, and at least in specific periods, in some of the officers who were present in the private hours. The finding was not a calculated decision, but the natural outcome of the specific quality of the protection relationship, its sustained presence in the private hours, combined with the specific interpersonal requirements of the role that selected for officers, with the human qualities that made the sustained presence manageable for both the officer and the principal. The officers who lasted on Diana's detail were officers who could be present with her without making the presence itself a source of additional institutional management, who could exist in the private hours in a way that Diana found less oppressive than the ordinary institutional management that the palace's other resources provided. The ones she trusted talked with her. The talking produced, in the officers who received the talking's content, knowledge of the specific kind that talking in private with a person who is telling you the truth about their existence produces in the person who is listening. It was not gossip that the officers accumulated. It was not the selective disclosure of a person managing her public image through carefully chosen briefings to selected recipients. It was the accumulated content of conversations in cars and corridors, and during the quiet hours of overseas tours, when the official program had ended, and two people were in a room together, and one of them was telling the other the truth about her life. The truth about Diana's life in the years of the marriage's worst deterioration was the truth that the Morton tapes eventually placed into the public record in Diana's own voice. The self-harm and the bulimia, and the isolation, and the fear, and the specific quality of the loneliness inside the marriage, and the specific nature of her relationship with Charles, and the specific ways in which the institution around her was failing to address what she was actually experiencing, were the contents of the truth. And those contents are in the public record, in the form Diana placed them there, in 1991, on the Morton tapes. What is not in the public record in the same form is what the protection officers knew of those same contents from their own direct presence in the environment where the contents were being produced as daily lived reality rather than as subsequent disclosure to a tape recorder. Diana told Morton what she had experienced. The protection officers were there when she was experiencing it. The knowing of someone who was present when the experience was occurring is a different knowing from the knowing of someone who received an account of the experience after it had occurred, and the difference is not a trivial one. It is the difference between the account and the witness. The account is what Morton received, and what the Morton tapes placed into the public record. The witness is what Mannakee was for 2 years, from approximately 1985 to the spring of 1987, when he was present in the environment where Diana's private life was occurring, and where the specific events and conditions and conversations that the Morton tapes subsequently described were happening in real time. His witnessing was the witnessing of someone whose professional role required him to be present, and whose personal relationship with Diana, as Diana described it on the Morton tapes, had developed into something that permitted a quality of direct engagement with what she was experiencing that the professional witnessing alone would not have produced. He was not only an observer of her environment, he was a person she talked to, in the specific way she described on the tapes, in the way that produced in him the specific knowledge that his sustained presence and her willingness to be present with him had together generated. What that knowledge specifically contained is not in any public record, because the man who held it died in May 1987 and left no account of it in any form that survived him. The gap in the public record where his account should be is the most complete gap that the protection officer's accumulated knowledge has produced, because it is the gap produced by death rather than by the review process or the obligation structure or the institutional management that has produced the partial rather than the complete gaps in the accounts of the other officers who came after him. The partial gaps are significant and are the subject of the following parts of this account. But the Mannakee gap is the complete gap, and its completeness is what makes it the center of what this account is assembling. The knowledge that died with Mannakee was the knowledge of the years that the Morton tapes described as the worst years, the years when the marriage's deterioration was most acute and least publicly visible, the years when Diana was in the specific condition that the tapes describe across their most difficult passages. He was there for those years. He was the person she talked to in those years, in the specific way she described on the tapes as a relationship of genuine closeness that the professional context had not prevented from developing. He heard what she said. He saw what the environment produced. He knew, in the fullest available sense of what a person can know about another person's private existence, what Diana's life was like in the period between approximately 1985 and the spring of 1987. And then he was gone. The going was the going of the transfer first, the institutional removal from the protection detail that the palace had arranged for the reasons the institutional management of the situation required, followed 6 weeks later by the accident on the A118 in East London that made the removal permanent in the way that death makes things permanent. What remained after the going was the gap. The gap is permanent in the same way that the death was permanent. It is the permanent absence from the public record of the most proximate witness to the years that Diana herself described as the most difficult of her life, in the recordings she made in secret, because the institution around her had no mechanism for preserving the truth of her experience in the ordinary channels that institutions use for the preservation of things they find worth preserving. The institution did not find Diana's private experience worth preserving in the forms she would have chosen for its preservation. The institution was organized around the preservation of the marriage's official presentation, not the preservation of Diana's private experience of the marriage's reality. The gap that Mannakee's death produced in the historical record of that private experience is the gap that the institution's management of the situation ultimately produced in its most complete form, the form of permanent absence, rather than the form of partial disclosure, constrained by review processes and obligation structures. Understanding what the gap contains requires understanding what the proximity produced, across the specific years of Mannakee's assignment, in someone whose presence in Diana's private environment was as continuous and as close as the protection role required, and whose personal relationship with Diana was as developed as the Morton tapes suggest it had become. The following part of this account examines what Diana told the Morton tapes about Mannakee, what those disclosures tell about what she told him directly in the years of his assignment, and what the combination of the proximity and the relationship and the specific period covered tells about the specific content of the knowledge that died with him on the 5th of May, 1987. The content is not in any single document. It is reconstructed from the intersection of what Diana said after his death about what the relationship had been and what the protection role's continuous presence in her environment during the years it covered would have produced in someone who was both professionally present and personally trusted. The reconstruction is the closest available approximation of what he knew. It is the closest that can be assembled from what survived. The Morton tapes were recorded in sessions across 1991 in a room at Kensington Palace by a woman who had understood something specific about the situation she was in. She understood that the institutional environment around her had no interest in preserving an accurate account of her private experience, that the palace's management of its communications was organized around the official version of the marriage, rather than around the truth of what the marriage contained, and that the truth of what the marriage contained was going to be lost unless she placed it somewhere outside the institutional management's reach. The tape recorder and the cassettes that were passed outside the palace through the arrangement she had made with Andrew Morton were the mechanism she found for placing it somewhere outside the institutional management's reach. The recordings were the product of a woman who had calculated, with the specific intelligence of someone who had spent a decade inside an institution organized against the preservation of her private experience, that the only available mechanism for the truth's survival was a mechanism the institution did not control. The recordings are in the public record. They were released after Diana's death in 1997, alongside the revised edition of Morton's book, and the specific passages that address Barry Mannakee are passages in Diana's own voice that constitute the most primary source available for what the relationship between Diana and Mannakee had been, and what it meant to her. The specific language Diana used on the tapes to describe her feelings for Mannakee has been quoted and paraphrased across the biographies and the accounts that examined the recordings in the years following their release. The language was the language of someone describing a relationship of genuine emotional significance rather than a professional attachment that had developed a warm quality across sustained contact. She described falling in love with him. She described the relationship in terms that made clear the emotional content of what had developed between them was something that the professional framework of the protection relationship had not contained and had not been designed to contain. She described, in the specific terms that the recordings preserve in her own voice, a relationship that had developed from the sustained proximity of the protection work into something that both people involved had experienced as significantly more than professional. The development was the development that the preceding part of this account described as the natural product of the protection role's continuous presence, combined with the specific emotional situation that Diana's circumstances in the years of the marriage's deterioration had produced. The sustained presence in the private hours, the accumulated contact across the full range of daily existence, the specific quality of a professional relationship whose requirements selected for interpersonal capacity and human attentiveness, all of these were the conditions that the development required, and the conditions were present across the years of Mannakee's assignment in the fullest possible form. What the emotional significance of the relationship for Diana means for the question of what Mannakee knew is the central analytical point that the tape's disclosures allow to be examined. A relationship of genuine emotional significance between two people who are in continuous daily proximity produces, in the person who is the non-principal party to the relationship, a specific quality of knowledge about the principal that a relationship of purely professional character would not produce. It produces that knowledge because the emotional significance of the relationship is the condition under which the principal discloses to the other person the things that the principal does not disclose in the purely professional relationship's more managed and more bounded context. Diana disclosed things to Mannakee that she disclosed to very few other people in the years of his assignment, because the relationship's emotional significance was the condition that permitted the disclosure and that distinguished the communication in that relationship from the communication in the other professional relationships that the institutional environment around her maintained. She talked to him. The talking was the talking that she described on the Morton tapes in terms that made clear it was not the talking of a principal briefing a protection officer on the operational requirements of the assignment. It was the talking of a person telling another person the truth about their existence. The truth she told him was the truth that the Morton tapes subsequently preserved in the recordings she made 4 years after his death. The specific content of the Morton tapes account of Diana's private experience in the years of the marriage's deterioration is the closest available approximation to the content of what she communicated to Mannakee directly in the years when the relationship between them was active and when the communication was occurring in real time, rather than in the retrospective form of a recording made after the person who had received the communication was dead. The tapes describe the self-harm. Diana spoke to Morton about the self-harm in terms that were specific about the methods and the frequency and the relationship between the self-harm and the specific conditions of the marriage that produced it. She described cutting herself. She described injuring herself in other ways. She described the self-harm as a response to the specific emotional conditions of her situation inside the marriage, as an attempt to communicate the internal distress in a form that could be externally observed, as a desperate expression of a pain that the institutional environment around her was not equipped to receive through the ordinary channels of human communication. The self-harm was occurring across the period of Mannakee's assignment. The protection officers present in the residences across the years of the marriage were present in the domestic environment where the self-harm was occurring, and the presence in that environment was a presence that the self-harm's occurrence made observable to the people inside it, in the specific ways that the domestic environment's intimate proximity produces observability. Mannakee was present in that environment. His presence was the continuous presence that the protection role required. The self-harm that was occurring in the environment his presence was continuously covering was occurring in the space that his presence was covering. He knew about it. The knowing was not the knowing of a secret disclosed in a direct conversation, though the relationship's emotional significance made direct conversation about Diana's psychological distress something that was within the range of what the relationship permitted. It was also, and perhaps primarily, the knowing of someone who was present in the domestic environment, where the distress was expressing itself in ways that were observable to anyone present in that environment, with the attention that the protection role required. The bulimia was similarly present across the period of Mannakee's assignment, and similarly observable to people in the domestic proximity that the protection role produced. Diana described the bulimia on the Morton tapes in terms that placed its onset in the period shortly before the marriage, the specific period of the engagement, when the specific pressures of becoming the person the institution required her to become had begun to produce in her the specific eating disorder that would continue across the years of the marriage and into the post-separation period. The bulimia was a daily feature of Diana's domestic existence across the years of the marriage, and the daily feature of the domestic existence was a feature that the protection officers present in the domestic environment across those years were present in proximity to. Mannakee was one of those officers for the approximately 2 years between roughly 1985 and the spring of 1987. He was present in the domestic environment of Kensington Palace and of the other residences across the full range of the daily schedule's hours, and beyond those hours, into the private hours that the official schedule did not cover. He was present in the proximity that the bulimia's daily expression produced as an observable feature of the domestic environment for anyone in the continuous presence that the protection role required. The specific nature of his relationship with Diana, the relationship of genuine emotional significance that she described on the Morton tapes, was the condition that would have given the observability of these features of her daily existence an additional dimension beyond the purely observational. A person in emotional relationship with someone who is experiencing acute psychological distress, who is self-harming and suffering from an eating disorder and communicating the distress in the specific ways that Diana communicated it, does not experience the distress only as an observed feature of the environment. The person in emotional relationship experiences it in the specific way that emotional relationship makes the distress of another person available to the person who cares about them. Mannakee cared about Diana. The caring is what the tapes describe, in Diana's account of her feelings for him, and in the implicit reciprocity of the environment, intend for those features to be observable to the people whose professional role requires them to be present in it. He also knew about it because Diana told him. The telling was the telling that the relationship's emotional significance permitted, the telling of a person who trusted another person with the truth of their situation, because the relationship between them was the kind of relationship in which the truth could be told rather than managed. What Diana told Mannakee about the marriage in the years of his assignment was what she subsequently told Morton on the tapes, because what she told Morton was what she had experienced in those years, and what she had experienced in those years was what the people she had trusted in those years had received as direct communication from her. Mannakee was one of the people she trusted. The evidence for the trust is on the tapes, in Diana's own description of the relationship and what it had meant to her and what its loss had cost her. The loss of the trust was the loss of the transfer, the institutional removal of the person she had found it possible to tell the truth to, from the operational environment where the truth was occurring. The transfer's institutional motivation, the palace's decision that the relationship had developed beyond the acceptable parameters of the professional context and required the removal of the officer from the assignment, was a decision that itself constituted evidence for the depth of the relationship and the degree to which the relationship had produced in Mannakee knowledge of Diana's private situation that the institution had found it worth removing him to address. Institutions do not transfer people for purely procedural reasons. They transfer people when the situation the people are in has developed in a direction the institution finds problematic, and the direction that the situation involving Mannakee had developed in was a direction that the institution found problematic because of what the development had produced in the relationship between him and Diana. What the development had produced was the specific kind of relationship in which Diana was communicating the truth of her private situation to someone who was simultaneously her protection officer and a person she trusted with the truth. The institution's response to the discovery of that relationship was the institution's standard response to the things it found problematic about the protection officer's development of personal relationships with the principles they protected: transfer. The transfer was the institutional management tool that addressed the situation in the institutional framework's terms, which were the terms of removing the person from the situation rather than examining what the situation had produced in the person who was being removed from it. What the situation had produced in Mannakee was the specific body of knowledge that the preceding paragraphs of this account have been reconstructing from the available evidence. The knowledge of Diana's self-harm, her bulimia, the specific psychological distress of the marriage's worst years, the specific nature of Charles's non-presence in the marriage, the specific conditions that were producing in Diana the acute crisis that would eventually lead her to seek the Morton recordings as the mechanism for placing the truth of her experience into a form that would survive the institutional management's preference for its non-preservation. All of this was the content of Mannakee's specific knowledge of Diana's private situation across the approximately 2 years of his assignment. The knowledge did not end when the transfer removed him from the assignment. The transfer ended his operational access to the ongoing production of new knowledge about Diana's daily existence. It did not erase the knowledge the assignment had already produced. The knowledge remained in his memory, in the specific form that direct experience of another person's private existence over a sustained period produces in the person who has had the experience. It was in his memory as the accumulated product of 2 years of continuous presence in Diana's private environment, combined with the specific emotional engagement of a relationship that the tape's account of its character suggests, had given the professional presence an additional personal dimension. The transfer happened in the spring of 1987. The knowledge remained with Mannakee across the 6 weeks between the transfer and his death on the 5th of May. His death on that date was the event that converted the knowledge's continued existence in his memory from a temporary condition, pending whatever form the knowledge might eventually find public expression in, to a permanent absence from the public record. The permanent absence is the Mannakee gap. The gap is permanent because the death was permanent, because Mannakee left no account of what the assignment had produced in his knowledge of Diana's private situation, because the people who might have received from him a communication of what he knew were not people who have subsequently placed that communication in any form that the public record contains. His family knew him as a person. The accounts of his son Paul across the years following the death, given in documentary and press contexts and cited in the biographical accounts of the period, describe a father whose experience of the transfer and the death was visible to his family in the specific ways that a significant professional disruption and its aftermath are visible to the people close to the person experiencing them. The family's account does not tell what Mannakee knew about Diana's private situation, because the family's knowledge of what Mannakee knew was not knowledge of the operational content of the assignment, but knowledge of a person in a specific emotional condition in the weeks following his removal from a situation that had mattered to him. The emotional condition was the condition of someone who had been removed from a relationship of genuine significance, the relationship with Diana that the institutional decision about the transfer had been organized around terminating. The termination of the relationship was the institutional management's achievement in the transfer's most personal dimension, the ending of the connection between a protection officer whose relationship with his principal had developed beyond the professional relationship's intended parameters, and the principal, whose private situation the connection had given the officer knowledge of. The knowledge remained after the connection was terminated by the transfer. The death ended the knowledge's potential for expression in any form that would have placed it in the public record. The gap that the death produced is the gap between the reconstruction that this account is assembling from the available evidence and the direct account that the person who held the knowledge would have been able to provide if the death had not occurred. The reconstruction can establish what Mannakee's assignment covered in terms of the period and the environment and the relationship's character. It can establish what Diana said on the Morton tapes about the period that his assignment covered and about the relationship that the assignment had produced between them. It can establish, from the combination of those two bodies of evidence, the general shape of what the specific knowledge that the assignment had produced in Mannakee would have contained. The general shape is the shape of the knowledge of someone who was continuously present in Diana's private environment across approximately 2 years of the marriage's most acute deterioration, who was in a personal relationship of genuine emotional significance with Diana across those years, who was the recipient of direct communication from Diana about the truth of her situation in the terms that the relationship's emotional significance permitted, and who carried the accumulated product of all of that across the 6 weeks between the transfer and the death, before the death made the accumulation permanently inaccessible. The general shape is the shape of a knowledge that was more specific and more complete than any other knowledge that the public record contains about Diana's private experience in the specific years that Mannakee's assignment covered. The Morton tapes are the closest available approximation to the same territory, but the Morton tapes are Diana's retrospective account of what she had experienced, organized around what she chose to include in the sessions with Morton, and shaped by the 4 years that had elapsed between the experiences being described and the description being recorded. Mannakee's knowledge was not retrospective, it was the direct knowledge of a witness, the knowledge of someone who was present when the experiences were occurring, and who understood them in the immediate form of their occurrence, rather than in the retrospective form of a disclosure made after the fact and shaped by the subsequent years of living with what the facts had been. That distinction is not a minor one. The retrospective account is the account that the public record contains, in the Morton tapes and in the biographies that drew on the tapes, and on the other sources that the retrospective accounts of Diana's close associates have provided across the years since her death. The direct witness account is the account that the public record does not contain, because the person who held it died before he could produce it in any form that would have allowed it to enter the record. Diana believed she knew why he died when he did. The belief is on the tapes, in the words that the tapes preserve in her own voice. The belief was the belief of a woman who had experienced the institutional removal of a person who knew the specific things about her private situation, that the institution's management of her public presentation had a structural interest in not having, in the possession of someone who might eventually speak about what they knew. Whether the belief was accurate about the death is the question the official investigations addressed and found no evidence to support. Whether the institutional interest the belief identified was real is a different question. The institutional interest in the removal of a protection officer who had developed a personal relationship with the princess and who therefore possessed direct knowledge of her private situation in the terms that the personal relationship and the professional proximity had together produced, was a real institutional interest, regardless of whether the death was connected to the transfer or was the road accident that the official record described. The transfer was the institutional management of the situation. The transfer's institutional motivation was the motivation of managing what the situation had produced in the officer and in the relationship between the officer and the principal. The managing of what the situation had produced included the managing of the knowledge that the situation had produced in the officer who was being transferred, in the specific sense that the transfer terminated the operational access that was producing the knowledge's ongoing accumulation. What it did not and could not terminate was the knowledge that had already accumulated across 2 years of the assignment. That knowledge was in Mannakee's memory at the point of the transfer and remained there across the 6 weeks that followed the transfer until the accident on the A118 terminated the memory along with the person who held it. Diana's description of her grief at his death, in the terms the Morton tapes preserve, is the description of someone grieving a person who had been genuinely important to her, rather than a professional contact, whose absence was a professional inconvenience. The grief was personal and specific, and organized around what the relationship had been, and what its loss meant for a woman, whose access to genuine human connection, in the institutional environment around her, was already severely constrained by the circumstances of the marriage. She lost the relationship when the transfer happened. She lost the person when the accident happened 6 weeks later. The loss of the person on top of the loss of the relationship was the specific compounding of grief that the tapes describe in Diana's account of how the news of his death reached her and how she received it, in the car with Charles on the way to the Cannes Film Festival, required to absorb the loss and then to proceed to the official engagement and perform the public role that the engagement required. The performance of the public role in the immediate aftermath of the news of Mannakee's death was the institutional requirement that the institutional environment's management of Diana's public schedule produced without regard for the specific emotional condition that the news had produced in her. The institution did not pause the public schedule to accommodate a princess's grief for a protection officer who had been transferred from her detail. The public schedule continued. Diana continued through it in the specific way that the institutional training of her position required, in the performance of composure across the public hours that the institution's management of her public image depended on. The composure was performed across the hours following the news in the specific way that the institutional requirements demanded. The grief was carried underneath the performance in the specific way that Diana carried the things the institutional requirements demanded be carried underneath the performance, rather than expressed through it. 4 years later, in the room at Kensington Palace with the tape recorder, she stopped performing. She told Morton about Mannakee in the terms the tapes preserve. She described what he had meant to her and what she believed about his death and what the loss of him had meant in the context of a life that was not producing adequate sources of the human connection that the institutional environment was failing to provide. The telling was the telling of someone placing on record, in the mechanism she had found that was outside the institution's management, what the institution's management had removed from her life through the transfer, and what the accident had made the removal permanent. She could place on record what he had meant to her. She could not place on record what he had known about her, because what he had known was in his memory, and his memory was gone. The tapes are the record of what Diana knew that Mannakee had known. They are not the record of what Mannakee knew, because Mannakee is not on the tapes. The tapes are Diana's account of the period that Mannakee witnessed, made 4 years after he died, recording from the retrospective position what the direct witness had been present for in the immediate form. The gap between Diana's retrospective account and Mannakee's direct witness account is the gap that this part of this account has been describing. The gap's content is not fully recoverable from the available evidence, because the content was in Mannakee's memory, and the memory is gone. What is recoverable is the reconstruction this account is assembling, the approximation of the gap's content from the intersection of what Diana disclosed on the tapes, and what the continuous presence of a person in personal relationship with her across those specific years would have produced in someone in Mannakee's position. The approximation is what remains. The direct account is what the 5th of May 1987 removed from the historical record of Diana's life. Ken Wharfe arrived on Diana's protection detail in the same year that Mannakee was removed from it. He served as her principal protection officer for 6 years, from 1987 to 1993, across the period that covered the marriage's public collapse, the separation announcement, and the years of Diana's navigation of her position as a separated princess. What Wharfe knew across those 6 years was different in content from what Mannakee knew, because the period was different and the specific events and conditions of the period were different. But the quality of the knowing was the knowing of the same kind, the knowing of continuous professional presence, combined with the personal trust that Diana extended to the people in her protection detail who earned it. Wharfe wrote a book. The book was cleared by the review process before publication. What the cleared book contains, and what the clearance process determined could not be contained in the cleared book, are the subjects that the following parts of this account address, because the gap between those two things is the gap that the institutional management of the protection officer's knowledge has produced in the public record of what the protection role's continuous presence in Diana's private environment accumulated in the people who occupied that role across the years of her life. The Mannakee gap is the complete gap, the gap of the death, rather than the gap of the review process. The Wharfe gap is the partial gap, the gap of the institutional management, rather than the management of death, and the partial gap is both smaller than the Mannakee gap, and more specifically documentable, because the cleared form of what Wharfe published exists alongside the knowledge that the clearance process determined should not be in the cleared form. Together, the two gaps define the outer limits of what the protection officer's knowledge of Diana's private life contained, and what the institutional management of that knowledge has produced, in terms of what the public record now holds and what it does not hold. The Mannakee gap is the one this account is organized around, because it is the most complete, and because its completeness is what the title names. He took everything to the grave. What everything was, is what the following parts of this account continue to reconstruct from the available evidence, through the specific examination of the period his assignment covered, and the specific events of that period that the reconstruction can establish his continuous presence for. The years between 1985 and 1987 were the years in which the Wales marriage reached the specific condition that the subsequent accounts of its deterioration consistently identify as the condition of irreversibility. Before those years, the marriage had been deteriorating in ways that the people inside the institutional environment around it understood as significant, and that the people outside it did not understand at all, because the institutional management of the marriage's public presentation had been effective enough across the preceding years to prevent the deterioration from becoming visible in the forms that public visibility requires. After those years, the irreversibility was the operating condition of a marriage that had ceased to be a marriage in any meaningful personal sense, while continuing to be a marriage in the institutional sense that the palace's management of its public presentation required it to remain. The specific period between 1985 and the spring of 1987 was the period in which the transition from deteriorating to irreversible occurred, and Mannakee was inside that transition as its most continuous professional witness. The transition had specific content. It was not the abstract narrative of a marriage failing in the general way that marriages fail when the people inside them discover they are incompatible. It was a transition with specific events and specific turning points and specific conditions that the participants experienced in specific ways, that the Morton tapes subsequently described in the specific terms that Diana's disclosures to Morton preserved. The specific events and turning points and conditions were occurring in the environment that Mannakee's continuous presence covered across those years. The Charles and Camilla dimension of the marriage's condition in those years was not a dimension that the public was aware of in the specific terms that the subsequent disclosures would eventually make available. The public awareness of Camilla Parker Bowles's significance in the marriage would develop across the years following the Morton book's publication, and would eventually reach the level of full public knowledge through the Dimbleby documentary of 1994 and the Panorama interview of 1995. In 1985 and 1986, and the early months of 1987, the public understanding of the marriage was the understanding produced by the official management of its presentation, which was the understanding of a settled royal union whose minor difficulties were being handled with appropriate institutional discretion. The protection officers present in the domestic environment of the marriage in those years were not operating inside the public understanding. They were operating inside the domestic environment itself, in the private hours that the official schedule did not cover and that the press photographers were not present for. The domestic environment of the marriage in those years was an environment in which the Charles and Camilla dimension of the marriage's condition was a daily feature of the private reality that the official requirement of the threat assessment that the protection work addressed. Diana's relationship with the protection officers she trusted was not the relationship of someone managing the information that reached the institutional management's channels. It was the relationship of someone who had come to understand the difference between the institutional channels and the people who were in the domestic environment, because the operational requirement of protecting her placed them there. Mannakee was one of the people she had come to understand in those terms. The relationship she described on the Morton tapes was a relationship in which the emotional significance had developed to the point where the ordinary boundaries between the principal and the protection officer had become less operative than they were in the purely professional version of the protection relationship. In a relationship of that character, the concealment that was organized around the institutional channels was not organized around the person inside the relationship with the same rigidity, because the relationship's emotional significance was itself a form of trust that the concealment's logic did not apply to in the same way. She told him things. The telling was the natural expression of a relationship in which the trust was genuine and in which the institutional management's preference for the concealment of her private condition was not the operating framework of the communication between them. What she told him was what she was experiencing, in the specific terms that a person in genuine emotional relationship with another person communicates what they are experiencing to the person they trust. The self-harm was a dimension of what she was experiencing in those years that she described on the Morton tapes, with the specific detail of someone who had lived through the experience and was describing it from the inside. She described the specific incidents. She described cutting herself with a penknife. She described throwing herself against a glass cabinet in the period of the marriage's acute crisis. She described the self-harm as the expression of a distress that had no other available channel in the institutional environment around her, the physical expression of an internal condition that the institutional management's channels were not designed to receive. The incidents she described on the tapes were incidents from across the years of the marriage's worst period. Some of them were incidents from the specific years of Mannakee's assignment. The incidents that occurred in the residences where Mannakee was continuously present across those years were incidents that occurred in the environment that his presence covered, and some of them were incidents whose occurrence in that environment his presence made him at minimum adjacent to, and in some cases directly aware of. The direct awareness is the awareness that the relationship's specific character produced beyond the observational awareness of the professional presence. A person who is in genuine emotional relationship with someone who is self-harming is not only an observer of the self-harm's physical evidence in the domestic environment. They are someone who has received, through the trust that the relationship has produced, communication about the self-harm in the specific terms that the person experiencing it communicates it to someone they trust. Diana communicated the distress to the people she trusted. Mannakee was one of the people she trusted in those years, in the specific terms that her subsequent account of the relationship on the Morton tapes establishes. The communication she made to the people she trusted in those years was communication of the distress's specific content, the self-harm, and the bulimia, and the isolation, and the specific nature of the marriage's failing, and the specific ways in which the institutional environment was not providing what she needed in the conditions she was in. The Charles and Camilla dimension of the marriage's specific failing was the most significant single element of what the marriage was producing in Diana in those years, and it was the element that her account on the Morton tapes addresses most extensively and with the most specific detail. The resumption of Charles's relationship with Camilla Parker Bowles, after a period in which the official management of the marriage's presentation had suggested the relationship was in the past, was the specific event that Diana described on the tapes as the turning point in her understanding of the marriage's actual condition. The turning point's specific timing in Diana's account places it in the early period of the marriage, before the years of Mannakee's assignment had begun. But the continuing operation of the Charles and Camilla relationship across the years of Mannakee's assignment was a continuing operation in an environment that Mannakee's presence in the domestic spaces of the marriage covered. The telephone calls between Charles and Camilla that Diana described as a feature of the marriage's domestic reality in those years were calls that occurred in the domestic environment that the protection officers were continuously present in, and the call's occurrence in that environment was occurrence in the operational space that the protection works requirements covered. The protection officer's awareness of Charles's telephone communications was an awareness produced by the operational environment of a domestic space, in which the principal's protection required continuous coverage of the domestic environment, including the spaces where the telephone communications occurred. The awareness was not the awareness of eavesdropping in the deliberate sense, but the awareness of presence in an environment where the communications were occurring and where the basic parameters of the communications were observable to anyone continuously present in the environment with the operational attention that the protection work required. Mannakee was continuously present in that environment. The awareness his presence produced was the awareness of the domestic environment's specific conditions in the years between 1985 and the spring of 1987, including the specific conditions that the Charles and Camilla dimension of the marriage was producing in that environment's daily reality. Diana's relationship with James Hewitt began in the period that the biographies examining the relationship most carefully place in approximately 1986. James Hewitt was a household cavalry officer who had come into Diana's social orbit through the equestrian connections that the household cavalry's role in the royal family's ceremonial and social life produced. The relationship that developed between them was a relationship that Diana subsequently disclosed first in her conversation with Morton and then in her own Panorama interview of 1995, in terms that confirmed the relationship's existence and its emotional significance to her across the years of its duration. The relationship began, in the biography's account of its timing, in the period of Mannakee's assignment. The protection officers who were present in Diana's domestic environment across the period of the relationship's beginning were present in the environment where the relationship's initial development was occurring as a feature of Diana's social life. Mannakee's assignment covered the period in which the Hewitt relationship was beginning, which placed him in the domestic environment in which a new significant relationship in Diana's private life was developing alongside the marriage's continuing deterioration. The specific knowledge that this produced in Mannakee was knowledge of a specific and sensitive kind, the knowledge of a protection officer whose continuous presence in the domestic environment of a princess whose marriage was failing had placed him in proximity to the beginning of a relationship that was simultaneously a natural human response to the marriage's specific conditions and a development of the specific institutional sensitivity that the protection officer's knowledge of it required to be managed within the obligation structures that governed the communication of information from the protection role to the outside world. The obligation structures were the structures that the preceding account of Diana's protection arrangements has described, the official secrets provisions and the contractual non-disclosure requirements, and the professional loyalty that together constituted the institutional management of the protection officer's accumulated knowledge. The structures applied to Mannakee across the period of his assignment in the same way they applied to the other officers, and they applied across the full range of what the assignment had produced in terms of knowledge of Diana's private situation. The range was a range that the preceding paragraphs of this account have been describing: the self-harm, the bulimia, the specific nature of the marriage's failing in those years, the Charles and Camilla dimension of the failing, the beginning of the Hewitt relationship, the daily psychological condition of a woman in acute distress, inside a failing marriage, inside an institutional environment that was not organized to address the distress in the terms the distress required. All of these were the content of what the continuous presence in the domestic environment across those years had produced in Mannakee's knowledge of Diana's private situation. The daily psychological condition was perhaps the most pervasive single element of what the continuous presence produced, because the daily psychological condition was the condition that was present across all of the other specific elements, rather than in only some of them. Diana's psychological state in those years was the state of someone experiencing a sustained crisis that was not being addressed by the institutional environment around her in any of the forms that the crisis's specific character required. The crisis was producing the self-harm and sustaining the bulimia and driving the search for human connection that the Hewitt relationship represented, and that the relationship with Mannakee himself represented in the terms that Diana described on the tapes. The daily psychological condition was something that a person in continuous presence in the domestic environment of the woman experiencing it would encounter as a daily feature of the environment, rather than as an exceptional event within it. Exceptional events stand out from the ordinary background of daily experience, and are therefore memorable in the specific way that exceptional events are memorable, as departures from the ordinary that the memory preserves precisely because of their departure quality. The daily psychological condition of someone in sustained crisis is not an exceptional event, it is the ordinary background, the texture of daily experience that continuous presence absorbs and integrates as the operating condition of the environment rather than as a departure from it. Mannakee absorbed it across 2 years of continuous presence. The absorption was not the absorption of someone who was professionally detached from what the environment was producing, because the relationship's emotional significance had made professional detachment less operative than it might have been in a purely professional protection relationship. The absorption was the absorption of someone who was emotionally engaged with the person in the crisis, and who therefore received the crisis's daily expression not only as an observable feature of the environment, but as a direct engagement with the condition of someone who mattered to him. The engagement produced in him a specific and detailed understanding of Diana's psychological condition in those years. That was the understanding of a person who had been inside that condition's daily expression for 2 years, rather than the understanding of a person who had received an account of the condition from someone who had experienced it. The distinction is the distinction the preceding part of this account, identified as the distinction between the account and the witness. Diana gave Morton an account. Mannakee was a witness. The witnessing covered specific incidents that the Morton tapes preserve in Diana's subsequent account, and that the continuous presence would have placed Mannakee in proximity to at their occurrence. The incident in which Diana threw herself down a flight of stairs at Sandringham while pregnant with Harry was an incident that the Morton tapes describe in Diana's own words, and that the biographies examining the marriage's worst years address as a documented instance of the crisis's most acute expression. The incident occurred in a royal residence in which the protection arrangements required continuous coverage of the domestic environment, including the domestic spaces where Diana was present. The biography's accounts of the Sandringham incident differ in some specifics of chronology and circumstance, reflecting the retrospective character of accounts assembled from multiple sources rather than from a single primary record. What the accounts are consistent about is the incident's occurrence and its character as an instance of Diana's acute psychological distress expressing itself in a physical form in the domestic environment of a royal residence. The protection officers who were on duty in the residence when the incident occurred were officers whose operational coverage of the domestic environment placed them in the specific relationship to the incident that continuous domestic coverage produces. The Kensington Palace incidents that Diana described on the tapes as instances of the self-harm's expression in the domestic environment were incidents that occurred in the residence where the protection arrangements maintained continuous coverage of the domestic environment. The cut made with the penknife that Diana described, the injury made with another implement that she described, these were incidents in the domestic environment of residences where the protection officers were continuously present and where the incident's occurrence was occurrence in the operational space that the protection coverage maintained. The subsequent accounts of the people who were present in the protection arrangements in those years are accounts that address the general picture of Diana's psychological condition without addressing the specific incidents in the specific terms that the official secrets obligations and the non-disclosure requirements prevent them from addressing in those terms. The general picture is addressed in the cleared forms of the accounts that the review process has permitted, and the specific incidents are addressed at the level of generality that the cleared forms accommodate, rather than at the level of specificity that the direct witness accounts of the incident's occurrence would have provided. Mannakee's account of the specific incidents would have been the account of someone who was present in the domestic environment when the incidents occurred, and who was in personal relationship with Diana in the terms the tapes describe, which is a different account from the general picture that the cleared forms of the other officers' accounts have provided. The specific account was the account that the death removed from the potential public record before any review process could determine what the cleared form of the account would have contained. The removal was the most complete removal that the institutional management of the protection officer's knowledge has produced, because it was the removal that death produces rather than the removal that review processes and obligation structures produce. Review processes and obligation structures produce partial removals, gaps in the accounts that the review process permits, that are gaps shaped by the determination of what the institutional management requires to remain outside the cleared form. Death produces the complete removal, the gap that is the complete absence of the account, rather than the partial absence that the review process shapes. The Mannakee gap is the complete absence. The years between 1985 and the spring of 1987 are the years that the complete absence covers, in the sense that the most proximate and most personally engaged witness to those years is the witness who is not in any form of the public record, rather than the witness who is in the public record, in the cleared and partially constrained form that the review process has produced. The overseas tours were another dimension of what those years contained, and what the continuous presence in those years would have produced in Mannakee's knowledge of Diana's condition across them. The official tours that the Wales marriage's public schedule required, across the mid-1980s, were tours that the protection arrangements covered in the specific conditions of overseas travel, conditions that are in some respects more revealing than the domestic conditions of the London residences, because the overseas environment removes the principal from the institutional support structure of the home environment and places them in the reduced context of a hotel suite and a daily schedule of official engagements with fewer of the ordinary domestic resources that the home environment provides. Diana's condition on the overseas tours of those years was the condition of someone managing an acute psychological crisis across the compressed conditions of overseas travel, while simultaneously performing the public role that the official schedule of the tour required. The compression was the compression of reduced space and reduced private time and reduced access to the personal resources that the home environment's greater familiarity made available, combined with the sustained performance requirement of an official schedule that was more intensive than the ordinary public schedule of the home environment. The protection officers were present across the overseas tours in the specific conditions that overseas coverage produces, the closer proximity of the reduced physical spaces of the hotel environments, and the more intensive operational coverage that the unfamiliar environment's greater unpredictability required. The closer proximity and the more intensive coverage placed the officers in a more concentrated exposure to Diana's private condition than the more distributed domestic environment of the home residences produced. And the more concentrated exposure produced in the officers a more specific knowledge of the condition's daily texture than the distributed exposure of the home environment's larger spaces allowed. Mannakee was on the overseas tours in the years of his assignment. He was present in the compressed conditions of those tours in the specific way that the principal protection officer's role in an overseas context places the officer in more sustained and more concentrated proximity to the principal than the home environment's distribution of the protection role across a larger team and a larger physical space allows. The compressed conditions of the overseas tours were conditions in which what Diana was experiencing in those years was more directly and more specifically observable to the officer in the most immediate protective proximity than the distributed conditions of the home environment produced. The overseas tours of the mid-1980s that the Wales marriage's public schedule required included the tours that the contemporary press coverage documented in its official dimension, and that the biographies examining the period have placed in the context of the marriage's private condition at the specific points in the deterioration that the tour's timing covered. The tour of Australia and New Zealand in 1983 had been among the earliest tours of the marriage, occurring in the period before Mannakee joined the detail, in conditions that the biographies describe as ones in which the marriage's difficulties were already present, but not yet at the specific intensity of the later years. The tours of the mid-80s were tours occurring in the later conditions, in the period of the marriage's acute deterioration that Mannakee's assignment covered. The specific tours of those years were tours in which Diana's public performance of the Princess of Wales role reached some of its most visible public success, generating the press coverage that established her global profile as a figure of extraordinary public appeal, while simultaneously being performed across conditions in the private hours of the tour that the public coverage was not observing and that the protection officers were continuously present in. The gap between the public performance and the private shape of what the direct account would have said, the specific content of the direct account, the specific incidents in the specific terms of the specific witness who was there for them, is the content that the grave received on the 5th of May 1987, and that has not come back out in any form the public record contains. The following part of this account examines the transfer and the accident in the specific terms of the events themselves and of what the events produced in terms of the permanent removal of the direct account from the historical record of Diana's life in those years. The transfer produced the institutional removal of the person from the situation. The accident produced the physical removal of the person from the world. Together, they produced the permanent removal of the most proximate and most personally engaged witness to the years they covered from any possibility of the public record's receipt of what the witnessing had produced. That is what it means to take something to the grave. Mannakee took it. The grave has kept it. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The transfer happened in the spring of 1987. The specific date of the decision, the specific meeting at which the decision was made, the specific individuals in the palace hierarchy whose awareness of the situation between Mannakee and Diana produced the institutional determination that the situation required resolution through the transfer mechanism. These are not matters of detailed public record in the form of documented minutes or preserved institutional communications that biographers and journalists have been able to examine directly. They are matters reconstructed from the accounts of people adjacent to the decision and from the observable consequences of the decision, rather than from the decision's own documentation. The institutional decisions of this kind, in the royal household's management of the protection arrangements, are not decisions that generate the kind of paper trail that other institutional decisions generate. They are decisions made within the informal management channels that the protection arrangements operate through, communicated through the operational hierarchy of the protection group, rather than through the formal correspondence channels that would produce a documentary record accessible to subsequent examination. The absence of a documentary record is not evidence that the decision was not made. It is evidence that the decision was made in the way that decisions of this kind are made in institutions that have developed, across long practice, the ability to manage sensitive personnel situations through channels that do not produce the documentation that public scrutiny would require. What is in the public record is the outcome. Mannakee was transferred from Diana's protection detail in the spring of 1987. The transfer was his removal from the operational environment of his assignment to a different operational posting within the Metropolitan Police structure. The removal was accomplished in the institutional vocabulary of career management and operational rotation that personnel transfers use in the protection arrangements, and it was accomplished with the specific speed that institutional decisions acquire when the people making the decision have determined that the situation requires prompt resolution rather than the gradual management that a less urgent situation would permit. The promptness of the transfer is one of the details that the accounts of the period most consistently note, and the promptness is itself evidence of the institutional assessment of the situation's urgency. Routine operational rotations in the protection arrangements do not produce transfers of the speed that the accounts of Mannakee's removal describe. Routine rotations are managed across the planning timescales that the protection group's operational scheduling requires, over weeks or months of preparation that the rotation's impact on the continuity of the protection coverage makes necessary. A transfer managed with the promptness that the accounts of Mannakee's removal describe is a transfer managed with the urgency that a situation assessed as requiring immediate resolution produces in the institutional management of personnel arrangements. The urgency's basis was the basis that the preceding parts of this account have described. The development between Mannakee and Diana of a relationship whose character the institution had determined had gone beyond the acceptable parameters of the protection relationship and required the removal of the officer from the assignment to prevent the further development of what the relationship had already produced. The further development that the removal was designed to prevent was the further accumulation of the personal knowledge of Diana's private situation that the relationship's emotional significance and the professional proximity together had been producing across the 2 years of the assignment. The removal was the institutional management of the situation in the specific form of the transfer mechanism. The transfer mechanism was the tool available for managing the situation without the confrontation that a more direct institutional response to what the relationship had become would have required. Confrontation being a response that the institution's management of sensitive personnel situations involving the royal principles consistently seeks to avoid, because confrontation requires the acknowledgement of what the confrontation is about, and the acknowledgement of what the confrontation with Mannakee would have been about was an acknowledgement the institution was not prepared to make in any form that would have produced a documentary record or a public communication. The transfer acknowledged nothing. It managed everything. The acknowledged basis of the transfer was the operational rotation that the protection group's management of its assignments requires, not the specific situation that had produced the decision to apply the rotation mechanism to this particular officer at this particular moment. The operational rotation vocabulary was the management vocabulary that permitted the institution to accomplish the transfer without the acknowledgement that the specific situation would have required if the specific situation had been the stated basis of the transfer rather than the unstated basis of the decision to apply the stated basis at this moment. Diana knew the real basis of the transfer. The Morton tapes make this clear in her account of the transfer and of her reaction to it. She described the transfer not in the operational rotation vocabulary that the institution used to communicate its basis, but in the terms of its actual basis, the institutional response to what the relationship between her and Mannakee had become, and what the institution had decided needed to be done about it. Her account of her reaction to the transfer was the account of someone responding to the loss of a personal relationship rather than to the operational reassignment of a protection officer whose rotation was a routine feature of the protection arrangement's management. The loss of the personal relationship was what the transfer produced in Diana's experience of it, and the production of that loss in her experience was the evidence that the transfer's real basis was the relationship rather than the operational rotation, because the operational rotation of a protection officer whose assignment had run its natural course would not produce in the principle the specific reaction that Diana described on the tapes. The reaction was the reaction of someone who had lost someone who mattered to her through the institutional action of people who had identified the mattering as a problem requiring management. Mannakee's experience of the transfer is not documented in the public record in the direct form that Diana's experience is documented in the Morton tapes, because Mannakee did not make recordings and did not give accounts of the transfer in any form that has entered the public record. What exists is the account of the transfer's effect on him that the people closest to him observed in the 6 weeks between the transfer and his death, and the account of those observations is the account that his family has provided across the years following his death, in the documentary and press contexts where they have spoken about the period. His son Paul Mannakee's accounts of his father, in the period between the transfer and the death, are accounts that describe a man whose experience of the transfer was visible to his family in ways that the family has described across multiple occasions of public speaking about the period. The descriptions are consistent in their account of a father whose emotional state in those weeks was a state shaped by the transfer in ways that went beyond the ordinary professional disappointment of an operational reassignment. The consistency across the family's accounts gives the description the quality of genuine observation rather than retrospective construction, the quality of people describing what they actually saw in someone they knew well, across a period they remember, with the specificity that the period's significance in their lives has preserved. The family's account does not describe the specific content of what Mannakee experienced in those weeks, in the terms that would require the family to have access to his internal experience, rather than to his observable condition. The family observed his condition. The condition they describe is the condition of someone dealing with something more significant than the ordinary operational adjustment of a career transition. Someone whose engagement with the 6 weeks of the transition period was an engagement marked by the specific quality that personal loss produces in a person, rather than the more mundane quality that professional change produces. The 6 weeks were 6 weeks. They were the period between the transfer that removed him from Diana's detail and the accident on the A118 in East London on the 5th of May 1987 that killed him. The period was long enough for the family to have formed the observations they subsequently described. It was too short for the period's end to have been anticipated by anyone who was observing the period from the inside, because the accident was the accident that the official investigation found to be the product of a road collision of the kind that happens without warning, and without the advance indication that would have made the period's end foreseeable to the people inside it. The specific circumstances of the accident are the circumstances that the official record of the time and the Operation Paget investigation conducted between 2004 and 2006 have established. Mannakee was a passenger on a motorcycle ridden by his colleague, Police Constable Stephen Peat. a Ford Fiesta driven by a 17-year-old named Nicola Taylor pulled out of a side road into the path of the motorcycle at the junction of the A118 with a side road in the Romford area of East London. The collision was the result of Taylor's failure to observe the approaching motorcycle, a driving failure that the subsequent criminal proceedings found sufficient to support a conviction for careless driving. Taylor was convicted. The conviction was the legal conclusion of the proceedings that the criminal justice system applied to the accident in the normal course of its management of road fatalities involving a finding of driver fault. The conviction named the party whose driving had caused the collision. The collision had killed the passenger of the motorcycle that the car had struck. The legal process produced the outcome that the legal process produces when a death on the road is the result of another driver's fault. The at-fault driver's conviction and the documentation of the accident in the official record as the product of that fault. Diana learned of Mannakee's death in the car with Charles on the way to the Cannes Film Festival. The Morton tapes preserve her account of the moment of learning and of the immediately subsequent hours in terms that describe the specific quality of grief and shock that the news produced in her, alongside the institutional requirement to continue to the engagement and perform the public role that the official schedule demanded. The grief was the grief of losing someone who had mattered to her in the specific terms the tapes describe. The shock had a specific quality beyond the ordinary shock of news of a sudden death, the quality of a death arriving 6 weeks after a transfer that had already removed the person from her daily life, in a way that the death's timing, coming so quickly after the transfer, gave a specific character that the tape's account of her reaction reflects. The timing was what Diana's subsequent account on the tapes focused on in constructing the belief she described about the death's deliberate character, the 6 weeks between the transfer and the accident being a period short enough that the sequence of transfer followed by death felt to Diana like a sequence rather than a coincidence. Whether the sequence was a sequence in the causal sense that Diana's belief required it to be is the question that Operation Paget examined with the resources of a formal Metropolitan Police investigation directed by Lord Stevens across 2 years between 2004 and 2006. The investigation produced its report in December 2006, running to 832 pages of documented findings on the specific claims and counterclaims that had accumulated around Diana's death and its surrounding circumstances. Operation Paget's examination of the Mannakee case was conducted in the specific terms of the investigation's overall mandate, which was the examination of whether Diana's death and the circumstances surrounding it were the product of deliberate action rather than accident. The Mannakee case was examined as a claimed prior instance of the same kind of deliberate action that the overall investigation was examining in relation to Diana's death, the claim that the institution had arranged the death of someone who knew too much about Diana's private life. The investigation found no evidence to support the claim in relation to Mannakee. Its examination of the accident's circumstances produced findings consistent with the official record of a road collision caused by the at-fault driver's failure to observe an approaching motorcycle, findings that the subsequent inquest proceedings had also produced and that the criminal conviction had incorporated. The investigation found no evidence of coordinated institutional action in the circumstances of the accident, no evidence of the specific mechanism that a deliberate arrangement of the accident would have required, and no evidence that connected the transfer's timing to the accident beyond the temporal proximity that Diana's belief was organized around. The findings are the findings of a thorough official investigation conducted by a senior police officer with the resources that a formal Metropolitan Police investigation commands. They are the most authoritative available answer to the specific question they examined, which was the question of whether Mannakee's death was the product of deliberate action. The answer was that the evidence did not support that conclusion. The answer the investigation produced in relation to the deliberate action question does not address the question this account is examining, which is not the question of whether the death was deliberate, but the question of what the death removed from the historical record by eliminating the person who held the knowledge that the preceding parts of this account have reconstructed from the available evidence. Those are different questions, and they have different answers. The deliberate action question has the answer Operation Paget produced. The knowledge removal question has the answer that follows from the fact of the death regardless of its cause, which is that the death of the person who held the knowledge removed the knowledge from the potential public record in the most permanent and most complete form that the removal of knowledge from the potential public record can take. The permanence and completeness of the removal are the same regardless of whether the death was deliberate or accidental. A deliberate removal of a person who holds specific knowledge produces the same permanent and complete removal of that knowledge from the potential public record as an accidental death of the same person. The knowledge that died on the 5th of May 1987 was the same knowledge, regardless of the cause of the death, that produced the knowledge's permanent absence from the record. Diana's belief about the death's deliberate character was a belief that the official investigations found no evidence to support. The finding does not change what the death produced in terms of the knowledge's permanent absence. The permanent absence is the fact that the death produced. The cause of the death is the question the investigations examined and found answered by the accident's circumstances. The permanent absence is the consequence of the death that the investigations did not examine, because the investigations were organized around the cause question rather than the consequence question. The consequence is what this account is examining. The consequence is the permanent absence from the public record of the most proximate and most personally engaged witness to the years between 1985 and the spring of 1987 in Diana's private life. The permanent absence is the Mannakee gap. The gap is what the 5th of May 1987 produced in the historical record of Diana's life, regardless of what produced the 5th of May 1987 itself. The gap has a shape that the preceding parts of this account have been reconstructing from the available evidence. The reconstruction tells the general content of what the gap contains, the knowledge that the continuous presence and the personal relationship and the specific period covered had produced in the person who is not in the public record. The reconstruction is not the gap's direct content, because the direct content was in the person's memory and the memory is gone. The reconstruction is the approximation of the direct content that the available evidence allows to be assembled. The available evidence for the reconstruction is the evidence that survived the gap's production. Diana's Morton tapes, the accounts of the other officers who served on her detail in the adjacent periods, the biographies that assembled from multiple sources, the picture of the marriage's private condition in those years, and the family's account of Mannakee in the 6 weeks between the transfer and the death. Together these sources produce the approximation of what the direct witness account would have contained. The family's account of those 6 weeks is the only source of evidence about Mannakee's state of mind and condition in the period between the transfer and the death that the public record contains. The account describes a man whose engagement with the 6 weeks reflected the transfer's impact on him in ways that the family observed as significant and as different from the ordinary professional adjustment of an operational reassignment. The family's observations are the observations of people who knew him and who were watching him across the period, and they describe what the watching produced in terms of the visible effects of the transfer on a person they knew well enough to identify what was ordinary for him and what was not ordinary. The extraordinary quality of what they observed in those 6 weeks is consistent with the account of the transfer's real basis that Diana provided on the Morton tapes. If the transfer was the institutional management of a relationship of genuine emotional significance, the extraordinary quality of its effect on the person transferred was the effect that the loss of a relationship of genuine emotional significance produces in the person who experiences the loss. The family's observations are consistent with that account. The observations are not consistent with the account of a routine operational rotation whose recipient was experiencing ordinary professional adjustment. The family knows the difference between the two conditions in someone they knew. What they observed was not the ordinary condition. Diana could not observe what the transfer produced in Mannakee across the 6 weeks, because the transfer had removed him from the environment where Diana was, and where the observation of his condition would have been possible through the ordinary contact that the assignment's continuation would have provided. She was told of his death in the car with Charles, 6 weeks after the last direct contact the transfer had permitted her. The 6 weeks were weeks in which the institutional removal of the relationship's operational dimension had already produced in her the grief of the loss that the death then made permanent. The death made permanent what the transfer had made institutional. The transfer had made the relationship's continuation in its operational form impossible through the institution's removal of the person from the assignment. The death made the relationship's continuation in any form impossible through the removal of the person from the world. The two removals together produced the permanent and complete form of the knowledge's absence from the potential public record, the form that makes the Mannakee gap the most complete gap that the institutional management of the protection officer's knowledge has produced. The completeness distinguishes it from every other gap that the protection officer's knowledge has produced in the public record. The Wharfe gap is the gap of the review process, the gap of what the cleared form of the published account does not contain, because the clearance process determined it should not. The Rees-Jones gap is the gap of the stated memory loss, the gap of what the surviving witness says he does not remember about the most significant moments. The Burrell gap is the gap of the legal proceedings that were ended before their evidentiary potential was reached. Each of these gaps is a partial gap, produced by an institutional management mechanism that produced an incomplete rather than a complete removal of the knowledge from the potential public record. The Wharfe gap exists alongside the cleared publication. The Rees-Jones gap exists alongside the account of what he does remember. The Burrell gap exists alongside the account that the ended proceedings had already produced and that the acquittal permitted him to publish. The Mannakee gap has nothing alongside it. There is no publication, cleared or otherwise. There is no account of what he does remember, because there is no mechanism by which the memory can be accessed. There are no proceedings whose partial evidentiary output the gap exists alongside. There is the family's observation of a man in the 6 weeks between the transfer and the death, which tells something about the condition that the transfer produced in him, without telling the specific content of what the transfer had removed from the operational environment. The specific content is the gap. The gap is complete. The completeness is permanent. Diana placed on the Morton tapes everything she could place there about the period the gap covers. She placed there her account of the self-harm and the bulimia and the marriage's specific condition in those years, and the relationship with Mannakee, and what she believed about his death. The account is the retrospective account of someone who experienced the period, and who described the experience 4 years after the most significant loss of the period, in the mechanism she had found outside the institutional management protection officer, the senior officer on her detail, in a role that placed him in the closest operational proximity to her across the full range of the protection arrangement's coverage of her daily existence. He held the role for 6 years, from 1987 to 1993, across a period that covered the most publicly significant years of Diana's life in terms of what the public eventually came to know about the marriage and its collapse. The years Wharfe covered were not the same years that Mannakee had covered. They were the years that followed the marriage's transition from deteriorating to irreversible, that the preceding parts of this account have described as the transition occurring in the specific period between 1985 and the spring of 1987. Wharfe arrived after the transition had occurred, in the period when the irreversibility was the operating condition of a marriage that was continuing in its institutional form while having ceased to be a marriage in any meaningful personal sense. He served across the period that produced the Morton book's publication in 1992, the separation announcement in December of that year, and the years of Diana's navigation of her position as a separated princess whose global popularity had become one of the most significant communications assets and most significant management challenges that the royal institution had ever encountered simultaneously. What Wharfe knew across those 6 years was the knowledge of someone who was continuously present in Diana's private environment across the most publicly consequential period of her life. The knowledge was the knowledge that the continuous presence in the domestic and operational environment of the protection role produces in the person who occupies the role across a sustained period, combined with the additional dimension that Diana's specific management of her relationships with the protection officers she trusted added to the purely observational dimension of the professional presence. Wharfe earned Diana's trust across his 6 years on her detail in the specific way that the officers she trusted earned it, through the quality of his presence in the private hours and through the specific human attentiveness that the protection roles reproduced. The book's publication was the first major breach in the institutional management of Diana's public presentation, the first significant entry into the public record of Diana's own account of what the marriage had actually contained. The publication produced in the institutional environment around Diana, a response of the kind that significant breaches in the institutional management of a public figure's presentation generate in the institutions responsible for managing that presentation. The palace's communications apparatus managed its response to the book through the channels it had available, the briefing network and the access relationships, and the institutional vocabulary of the managed response that the preceding parts of this account have described across other contexts. The managed response was the management of an event that had already occurred, rather than the prevention of an event that was approaching, and the management's specific form was the form appropriate to the management of damage that had been done, rather than the management of damage that was being prevented. Wharfe was Diana's principal protection officer across the period of the Morton book's production and publication. He was present in Diana's private environment across the specific sessions that Diana described on the tapes as the sessions in which the recordings were made. The sessions in the room at Kensington Palace, in which she spoke into the tape recorder and produced the cassettes that were passed outside the palace through the arrangement she had made with Morton. He was the protection officer whose operational coverage of Diana's movements and her domestic environment in those sessions placed him in the closest professional proximity to the process through which the recordings were being produced. The proximity does not constitute knowledge of the recording's specific content, because the sessions in which the recordings were made were sessions that Diana was conducting alone in the room with the tape recorder, the specific arrangement she had designed to prevent anyone in the operational environment of the palace from knowing what she was producing. Wharfe's proximity to the process was the proximity of the protection officer whose operational coverage of Diana's environment placed him adjacent to the sessions rather than inside them, present in the spaces outside the room where the recordings were being made, rather than in the room itself. What the proximity did constitute was awareness of the pattern of Diana's activities across the period of the recording's production, awareness of the specific occasions and the specific times when Diana was engaged in the activities that the recording sessions constituted within the pattern of her daily schedule. The awareness was not the awareness of the recording's content, but the awareness of the pattern that the recording's production created in Diana's activities. The pattern that someone in continuous coverage of her daily schedule would register as a distinctive feature of the schedule across the period retains that position across the different public contexts in which they are asked to speak. Wharfe maintains the consistent position. The position is the position of acknowledged general picture, combined with withheld specific incident. The position of someone who confirms the significance of what the years covered in the general terms that the cleared form permits, without providing the specific incidents in the specific terms that the full knowledge would allow. The navigating quality is most visible in the moments when the questions posed in the interview or documentary contexts press closest to the specific incidents that the cleared form does not contain, the moments when the constraint is most directly tested by the specific nature of what is being asked. In those moments, the navigating quality produces the specific response that the constraint requires, the response that acknowledges the general territory being asked about without providing the specific content that the question is organized around reaching. The response is not evasion in the simple sense of avoiding the question. It is the specific response of someone who is communicating as much as the constraint permits, while communicating clearly, to anyone familiar with the structure of what the constraint produces, that the constraint is the reason for the response's specific character, rather than the absence of knowledge on the other side of the constraint. The structure of what the constraint produces is legible to anyone who examines the public presentations with the attention to what is being said, alongside what is not being said, that the constraint's operation requires for its visibility. The constraint is visible in the navigating quality, and the navigating quality's visibility is evidence of the constraint's operation, and the constraint's operation is evidence of the knowledge on the other side of the constraint that the operation is designed to manage. The other officers who served on Diana's detail across the years following Mannakee's death and across the parallel and subsequent period of Wharfe's service are officers whose public record is the public record of the vast majority of the pretensions about Diana's life have sought from people who were close to her. They have maintained, across the years since her death, the silence that the obligation structure's combination of legal requirement and professional loyalty has produced as the default condition of the protection officer's relationship to the public record. The majority's silence is the most extensive dimension of the knowledge gap that the protection officer's service with Diana has produced in the public record's available account of her private life. The Mannakee gap is the complete gap of a single person, produced by death and therefore absolute in its completeness. The Wharfe gap is the partial gap of a single person, produced by the review process and therefore partial in its completeness. The majority's silence is the aggregate of the partial and complete gaps produced by the obligation structure's management of the large number of officers whose service with Diana generated the same continuous professional presence in her private environment that the preceding parts of this account have described in the specific cases of the individual officers whose public profiles have made them individually identifiable in the public records examination of the protection arrangements. The aggregate is substantial. The protection arrangements for the Princess of Wales across the years between the wedding in July 1981 and the death in August 1997 required a protection team of multiple officers rotating across the continuous coverage that the threat assessment demanded. The principal protection officer role that Mannakee and then Wharfe occupied was the most senior and most continuously proximate role in the team, but the team as a whole included the other officers whose operational coverage of Diana's environment placed them in the protection role's continuous presence across the full range of the daily hours. Each of those officers accumulated, across their period of service on the detail, the specific knowledge that the continuous presence in the domestic and operational environment of the protection role produces in the people who occupy the role across a sustained period. The majority of those officers have not placed that knowledge in any form that the public record contains, because the obligation structure's management of the protection officer's communications has produced as its most extensive product the silence of the majority, rather than the partial disclosure of the cleared publication or the complete disclosure that the absence of the obligation structure would permit. The majority's silence is the institutional management's most effective achievement across the full extent of the protection officer's accumulated knowledge of Diana's private life, more effective than the review process that shaped the cleared publications, and more effective than the obligation structure's legal enforcement in any specific case, because the majority's silence does not require active institutional management of specific individuals in specific circumstances. It is the self-sustaining product of an obligation structure that produces silence as the default, rather than as the outcome of institutional intervention, maintained by professional loyalty and institutional conditioning, rather than by the active enforcement of the legal provisions that the obligation structure also includes. The self-sustaining character of the majority's silence is what makes it the institutional management's most durable achievement. The cleared publications required the institutional engagement of the review process applied to specific individuals who had decided to publish. The majority's silence requires no institutional engagement because the majority has not decided to publish, and the default of silence is the condition the obligation structure produces in people who have not made the specific decision to publish and have not therefore triggered the specific institutional response that the decision to publish activates. The people who have broken from the majority's silence and entered the public record in various forms have entered it in forms that reflect the different mechanisms available for breaking from the silence and the different institutional responses those mechanisms activate. Wharfe's cleared publication is the most formally managed form of the break from the majority's silence, the form that submitted the break to the institutional management process before the break occurred and received the management process's determination of what the cleared form would contain. The result is the cleared book alongside the gap that the clearance process produced. Other officers have entered the public record in less formally managed forms, through documentary appearances and press interviews, and the various contexts that the sustained public interest in Diana's life has created for people who were adjacent to her, and who have decided, in varying degrees and in varying contexts, to speak about the adjacency. The less formally managed forms of the break from the majority's silence are forms that the obligation structure's enforcement mechanism must address reactively rather than proactively, responding to disclosures that have already occurred rather than shaping disclosures before they occur. The reactive enforcement produces its own specific quality of incompleteness in the public record's available account, incompleteness of a different kind from the incompleteness produced by the proactive review process. The proactive review process's incompleteness is the gap of the cleared publication, the gap between what the cleared form contains and what the full knowledge would contain. The reactive enforcement's incompleteness is the gap of the disclosure that occurred before the enforcement response, the gap between what the disclosure placed in the public record and what the enforcement response determined should not have been placed there. The combination of the Mannakee gap, the Wharfe gap, the majority's silence, and the reactive enforcement's specific form of incompleteness together constitute the full extent of what the protection officer's accumulated knowledge of Diana's private life contains, and what the public record has access to, and what it does not. The full extent's inaccessible dimension is the dimension whose general shape this account has been reconstructing from the available evidence. The reconstruction is the approximation available to anyone examining the public record with the attention to what is present and what is absent that the reconstruction requires. The approximation tells the general content of the inaccessible dimension across the different cases and across the different years and conditions that the different assignments covered. What the approximation tells across all of the cases is consistent in one specific respect. The inaccessible dimension of the knowledge that the protection officer's service with Diana accumulated is the inaccessible dimension that corresponds to the private reality of Diana's experience that the official management of her public presentation was simultaneously producing in its managed public form. The public form is what the official management's channels produced and what the public record received through those channels across the years of Diana's life. The private reality is what the protection officer's continuous presence in the domestic environment of that private reality accumulated as the knowledge of direct witnesses rather than the knowledge of managed presentations. The gap between the public form and the private reality is the gap that the Morton tapes partially crossed when Diana placed her retrospective account of the private reality into the mechanism she had found outside the institutional management's reach. The tape's crossing of the gap was partial because it was retrospective, because it was Diana's account of what she had experienced rather than the direct witness accounts of the people who had been present when she was experiencing it, and because the institutional management's response to the tape's public release was the management of the retrospective account rather than the management of the direct witness accounts that the protection officers held. The direct witness accounts are the accounts the public record does not have in the specific terms of the direct witness's own telling. The public record has the retrospective account and the cleared forms and the majority's silence and the complete gap that the Mannakee death produced at the beginning of the period the public record is attempting to account for. The period the Wharfe years covered produced the most significant events in terms of what eventually entered the public record of Diana's private life, through the Morton book, and the separation announcement, and the Charles Dimbleby documentary, and the Panorama interview. Wharfe was inside those years as their most continuous professional witness, and what he knew across those years was the knowledge that the years produced in someone who was continuously present in their domestic and operational environment. The cleared book is the form of that knowledge that the public record contains. The gap between the cleared book and the full knowledge is the form that the institutional management produced across the 6 years of the public record's most significant gap in the available account of Diana's private experience. The gap is partial, in the specific sense that the cleared book contains a substantial and detailed account of the period that the full knowledge would expand and deepen rather than replace entirely. But partial gaps are still gaps, and the content on the other side of Wharfe's gap, the specific incidents, in the specific terms of the direct witness account, is content the public record does not have. The specific incidents include the specific occasions when Diana's self-harm was most acute across the years of the separation and the post-separation period. The specific texture of what the daily psychological condition of the most publicly celebrated woman in the world looked like in the private hours that the public coverage of those years did not capture. They include the specific quality of the interactions with Charles across the years of the separation's management, the specific content of what the domestic environment of the marriage's institutional continuation, alongside its personal collapse, produced in the daily reality of the residences where both of them were sometimes present. They include the specific nature of Diana's navigation of her relationships in those years, the relationships that the biographies and the public accounts address in the general terms that the available sources permit, and that the specific witness account would address in the specific terms of what the continuous protective presence in those relationships' operational environment produced as direct knowledge of what they actually contained. These are the contents of the Wharfe gap, specified at the level of general category rather than specific incident, because the specific incidents are in the cleared books gap rather than in the public records available account. They are the contents that 6 years of continuous professional presence in Diana's private environment across the most publicly significant period of her life would have produced in someone who was both professionally present and personally trusted, accumulated across the full range of the daily hours and the overseas tours and the private residences and the official engagements and the quiet periods between them. The comparison between the Mannakee gap and the Wharfe gap is the comparison between the complete and the partial, between the absence produced by death and the absence produced by the review process, between the gap that has nothing alongside it and the gap that has the cleared book alongside it. The comparison tells something about the different mechanisms available to the institutional management of the protection officer's knowledge and the different forms of incompleteness that the different mechanisms produce in the public record. The Mannakee gap's completeness is absolute. The Wharfe gap's partiality is significant. The majority's silence extends across both dimensions and across the full personnel complement of the protection arrangements across the years of Diana's life, producing in aggregate the most extensive dimension of the inaccessible knowledge that the public record's available account of her private life contains. Together they constitute the full shape of what the protection officers knew and what the public record has received, and what it has not received from the people who knew it. The Paris dimension of the knowledge gap, the dimension produced by the events of the 31st of August 1997, and the single surviving witness to those events, belongs to the following part of this account, because the Paris gap is the gap produced by the most publicly examined event in Diana's life, and because its specific character is the character of a knowledge gap, produced not by death or by review processes or by the majority's maintained silence, but by the stated absence of memory in a single surviving witness whose account of what he remembers and does not remember has been the subject of more official and public examination than any other dimension of the protection officer's accumulated knowledge of Diana's life. The examination produced its findings. The findings addressed the questions the examinations were organized around. The gap in the surviving witness's account remains the gap it has been since the morning of the 31st of August, 1997, in the specific location, in the most examined event of Diana's life, where the direct witness account of the most significant moments is the account that the surviving witness says he does not have. Whether he does not have it because the trauma of the accident removed it, or whether the account exists in memory that the surviving witness has decided not to share in the public form that the examinations have sought, is the question that the available evidence cannot resolve, and that the examinations did not resolve. The gap is in the same place regardless of which answer to the question is the accurate one. It is in the place where the most significant moments of the most examined event in Diana's life should be. Trevor Rees-Jones was seated in the front passenger seat of the Mercedes S280 when it entered the Pont de l'Alma tunnel at approximately 12:23 in the morning of the 31st of August, 1997. He was wearing a seatbelt. The three people in the rear and behind the wheel were not. The car struck the 13th pillar of the tunnel at a speed that the subsequent French judicial investigation established was between 95 and 100 kilometers per hour, in a zone with a speed limit of 50 kilometers per hour. The collision killed Henri Paul, who was driving, and Dodi Fayed, who was in the rear, and Diana, Princess of Wales, who was also in the rear, and who died at the Pitié-Salpêtrière hospital in Paris in the early hours of the morning, after the medical staff, who worked to save her life across those hours, were unable to do so. Rees-Jones survived. His survival was the survival of someone who had been wearing a seatbelt in a high-speed collision that killed 3 of the 4 people in the vehicle, a survival whose margin the medical staff who treated him at the hospital found extraordinary, given the forces the collision involved and the injuries the forces had produced. His facial injuries were severe enough to require a medically induced coma in the hours following the crash and multiple reconstructive surgical procedures across the weeks of his initial hospitalization. His recovery was the recovery of someone whose physical injuries were being progressively addressed through the sustained medical attention they required, across a period of hospitalization and subsequent recuperation that extended well beyond the initial emergency response. The memory of the moments immediately before the impact did not recover alongside the physical injuries. The memory's non-recovery is what Rees-Jones described, beginning with the earliest accounts he gave in the period following the crash, and continuing across every subsequent public engagement with the question of what he remembered of that night. The description was consistent across the years and across the different contexts in which the question was put to him, in the French judicial investigation's formal interviews, in the Operation Paget investigation's examination of his account, in the inquest proceedings conducted by Lord Justice Scott Baker in 2007 and 2008, and in the book he published in 2000, under the title The Bodyguard Story, written with the journalist Moira Johnston. The consistent description across those different contexts and across the years between them has the specific quality that consistency across independent examination contexts and extended time periods gives to an account. It is the consistency of someone who is describing the same thing because the same thing is what they have to describe, rather than the consistency of someone maintaining a constructed account with the deliberate effort that maintaining a construction requires across the demands of sustained formal and informal examination. The description describes an absence. The memory of the moments immediately before the impact is not there, by Rees-Jones's account, in the form that would allow him to describe what those moments contained. The memory gap covers the specific period from a point before the tunnel's entry that he has described as the last point his available memory reaches to the point after the collision, at which his awareness resumed in the specific fragmentary form that severe head trauma produces in the resumption of consciousness after a period of unconsciousness. The medical explanation for the gap is the explanation that the neurological literature on traumatic amnesia provides for the specific phenomenon of retrograde amnesia, the absence of memories from the period immediately preceding a severe traumatic event, in cases where the traumatic event involves the kind of cranial trauma that Rees-Jones sustained. The explanation is real, in the sense that the neurological literature supports its existence as a documented phenomenon occurring in cases with the specific character of Rees-Jones's injuries. The medical community that examined his case in the hospital and in subsequent medical assessments has not publicly contested his description of the memory gap as inconsistent with the nature of his injuries and their neurological consequences. The medical reality of the phenomenon does not resolve the question of whether the phenomenon is what is producing the absence in Rees-Jones's specific case, because the medical reality of a condition's existence as a documented phenomenon does not establish that the documented phenomenon is present in any specific individual's case. The distinction is the distinction between the medical literature's documentation of retrograde amnesia as a real condition and the specific determination, in a specific person's case, of whether the condition is what is producing the account of absent memory, rather than the account being the account of memory that exists, but is being described as absent for reasons other than the condition's presence. The distinction is the distinction that the examination of Rees-Jones's account across the French judicial investigation and Operation Paget and the inquest proceedings has consistently encountered and consistently been unable to resolve from the available evidence, because the available evidence for resolving the distinction in any specific case is the individual's neurological record and the medical assessments of that record, and those assessments have not been made publicly available in the comprehensive form that would allow the distinction to be resolved from outside the medical examination itself. What Operation Paget examined in relation to the memory gap was the memory gap's consistency with the specific nature of the injuries Rees-Jones sustained, and with the broader evidence the investigation assembled about the events of that night. The investigation found the memory gap consistent with those factors, It found no evidence that the gap was the product of deliberate withholding rather than the neurological consequence of the trauma. The investigation's findings are findings about the consistency of the described gap with the available evidence, rather than findings about the neurological reality of the gap's cause, in the specific terms that the medical literature's documentation of the phenomenon would require for a definitive determination. The consistency finding is the most authoritative available determination of the gap's character, in the terms that an official investigation with the resources operation. The sources that address the circumstances from outside the vehicle are the sources that the French judicial investigation and Operation Paget and the inquest assembled from the people who were present in the Pont de l'Alma tunnel and its approach in the period before and during the crash. The photographers who were following the vehicle, the witnesses who were in the tunnel or at its approach, the drivers of the other vehicles whose accounts describe what they observed of the Mercedes's progress through Paris in the period before the tunnel entry. These sources address the external circumstances of the vehicle's progress from the positions of people who were observing the vehicle from outside it. The internal circumstances of the vehicle in the moments before the impact are the circumstances that only the people inside the vehicle could have observed from the inside. 3 of the 4 people inside the vehicle are dead. The 4th is alive and describes the moments before the impact as moments his available memory does not reach. The gap between the external evidence from the outside witnesses and the internal evidence from the inside witness is the gap that the internal witness's described memory gap produces in the examination of what happened inside the vehicle in the moments before the crash. The gap is the most specific form of the knowledge gap that this account has been examining across its preceding parts, in the specific sense that it is the gap in the most directly examined event in Diana's life, rather than the gap in the less examined private hours of the domestic environment that the preceding parts have addressed. The Mannakee gap is the gap of the private hours. The Wharfe gap is the gap of the cleared publication. The Paris gap is the gap of the most publicly examined event, the gap in the surviving witness's account of the moments that the examination most needs the witness to illuminate. The most publicly examined event in Diana's life is the event whose examination has produced the most extensive body of official findings and public documentation. Across the French judicial proceedings and Operation Paget's 832-page report and the inquest proceedings and the subsequent parliamentary and public discussion of those proceedings, the extensive body of official findings and public documentation is the most thorough official examination that any event in Diana's life has received, conducted with the resources of multiple official institutions across multiple years and producing findings of the specific authority that formal official investigations produce. The findings address what the examination could address, which was the circumstances of the crash, as established from the available evidence outside the surviving witness's account of the specific moments the gap covers. The findings established the speed of the vehicle, the blood alcohol level of the driver, the behavior of the pursuing vehicles, the physical dynamics of the collision. The inquest jury's verdict of unlawful killing through the grossly negligent driving of Henri Paul and the pursuing vehicles was the conclusion that the findings supported as the most accurate available characterization of how Diana died. The verdict addressed the question of how Diana died in the terms that the available evidence allowed the jury to address it. It did not address the question of what the surviving witness remembers of the moments the gap covers, because that question is not a question that a jury verdict can address in the terms the question requires. The jury verdict is the collective determination of a group of people examining the evidence available to them. The memory of a specific person in specific moments is not available to jury examination in the same form that physical evidence and witness testimony about external circumstances are available. Rees-Jones gave evidence at the inquest. His evidence was examined by the legal teams representing the interested parties, each of whom had interests in establishing aspects of the crash's circumstances that their clients' positions required. The examination of his evidence was the adversarial examination that the inquest process makes available when the interested parties have legal representation and the ability to put questions to witnesses. The adversarial examination is one of the most effective available mechanisms for testing the consistency and reliability of a witness's account, because the adversarial process is designed to identify inconsistencies and implausibilities that a less searching examination would miss. The adversarial examination of Rees-Jones's account at the inquest did not produce departures from the consistent account he had maintained since the crash. The questions addressed to the memory gap did not produce accounts of remembered moments that his previous statements had described as not remembered. The adversarial process produced its most thorough available examination of the gap's character and produced from the examination the same consistent account that every previous formal and informal examination of the gap had produced. The consistency across adversarial examination is the most significant available evidence for the gap being the product of the neurological condition, rather than of a decision about what to describe as remembered, because adversarial examination is the process designed to reveal the inconsistencies that maintaining a constructed account across sustained questioning produces in the people maintaining it, and the consistency across that process is the consistency most difficult to maintain artificially. The consistency is the evidence for the gap's genuineness. The evidence is significant. The evidence is also not conclusive in the absolute sense that the distinction the examination of the gap requires would demand for a conclusive determination, because the consistency of an account across adversarial examination is the strongest available evidence for the account's accuracy, rather than the definitive proof of it. The gap remains in the position it has occupied since Rees-Jones first described it in the accounts he gave in the period following the crash. It is in the position of the moments before the impact in the Pont de l'Alma tunnel. It covers the period from the last point his available memory reaches to the moment his awareness resumed in the fragmentary form that followed the collision. It contains whatever was occurring inside the vehicle in the moments the gap covers, in the specific form that the direct witness account of someone who was present and conscious and aware in those moments would have produced if the memory were available to him. The content of the gap's coverage is what the public examination of the crash's circumstances has most consistently been unable to establish from the available evidence outside the gap. The speed and the blood alcohol and the pursuit are established. The internal moments are the gap. The book Rees-Jones, published in 2000, The Bodyguard Story, addresses the events of that night in the terms that his available account allows, which are the terms of what the available memory reaches before the gap begins, and what the fragmentary awareness after the collision produced. The book describes the evening, the departure from the Ritz, the route through Paris, the approach to the tunnel, and then the gap, and then the fragmentary awareness of aftermath. The description of the gap is the description of an absence, characterized in the terms that someone describing an absence characterizes it, as the specific location where the memory does not go. The book was published with the involvement of Mohammed Al-Fayed's legal and communications apparatus in the period when Al-Fayed was pursuing his own investigation of his son's death and was engaging every available means of establishing what had occurred in the tunnel. Al-Fayed's theory of deliberate causation required the surviving witness's account of the tunnel's interior moments to support it, and the surviving witness's description of the gap as the location where the memory did not go was not the support the theory required. Al-Fayed responded to the gap by publicly questioning whether the gap was genuine, suggesting that Rees-Jones remembered more than he was describing, and that the failure to describe the full memory was the product of external pressure rather than neurological consequence. The public questioning placed Rees-Jones in the specific position of someone whose stated experience of his own memory is being publicly contested by someone with a financial and personal interest in a different account of what the memory contains. The position is an uncomfortable one, and its discomfort is observable in the accounts of Rees-Jones's public engagements with the question across the years following the book's publication. The discomfort is not the discomfort of someone managing the exposure of a constructed account. It is the discomfort of someone whose honest account of their own experience is being contested by a party with interests in the contestation, which is a different discomfort, and one that the people who have spoken with Rees-Jones across those years describe in terms consistent with the discomfort's specific character. The Paris gap differs from the Mannakee gap and the Wharfe gap in the specific sense that its production does not involve the institutional management mechanisms that the preceding parts of this account have described as the mechanisms through which the knowledge of Diana's protection officers has been managed toward the public record's current state. The Mannakee gap was produced by death, which is the most complete of the mechanisms that have produced knowledge gaps in the protection officer's accumulated knowledge of Diana's private life. The Wharfe gap was produced by the review process, which is the institutional management's most formally documented mechanism for shaping what enters the public record from the protection officer's published accounts. The majority's silence was produced by the obligation structure's management of the default condition of the protection officer's communications. The Paris gap's production does not involve those mechanisms in the same way. Rees-Jones was not a royal protection officer at the time of the crash. He was employed by Mohammed Al-Fayed's private security operation. The official secrets provisions and the contractual non-disclosure obligations that the Metropolitan Police's Royal Protection Group places on its officers and former officers were not the obligations Rees-Jones operated under. His obligations were the obligations of his employment with the Al-Fayed organization and the subsequent legal obligations that the French judicial proceedings placed on him as a witness in active proceedings. The gap is therefore not the product of the institutional management mechanisms that produce the other gaps this account has examined. It is the product of a neurological event, by Rees-Jones's account, or of a decision about disclosure, in the alternative account that the official examinations found not supported by the available evidence. The Paris gap belongs in this account not because it is the product of the same mechanisms that produced the Mannakee gap and the Wharfe gap and the majority's silence, but because it occupies the same territory, the territory of what the most proximate witness to a significant event in Diana's life knows, and what the public record has access to, and what it does not. The territory that the Paris gap occupies is the territory of the event's most significant moments, the moments inside the vehicle, in the Pont de l'Alma tunnel, in the seconds before the impact that killed Diana. It is the territory that the official examinations most directly needed the surviving witness to illuminate, and it is the territory that the surviving witness's described memory gap covers, in the specific form of a location where the memory does not go. The public examination of the Paris gap across the French judicial proceedings and Operation Paget and the inquest is the most extensive official examination of any gap in the available account of the events of Diana's life that any official process has produced. The examination produced its findings. The findings established what the examination could establish about the gap's character and about the circumstances of the crash that the available evidence outside the gap allowed to be determined. What the examination could not produce was the content of the gap itself, because the gap's content is in the location where the memory does not go, and the examination of a location where memory does not go cannot produce the content that the memory's presence would have made available. The examination can produce findings about the gap's character and consistency with the available evidence. It cannot produce what would be inside the gap if the memory were there. What would be inside the gap if the memory were there is the content that the question of what happened in the Pont de l'Alma tunnel in the moments before the impact most directly requires. It is the content of the direct witness account of those moments from someone who was present inside the vehicle and conscious and aware in the period before the impact removed his consciousness and the trauma removed his memory of the period. The content of that account is the most specific and most directly relevant piece of missing evidence that the examination of Diana's death has produced in the public record's attempt to give a complete account of how she died. The physical evidence and the outside witness testimony and the official findings have produced an account of how she died that the inquest jury found adequate to support a verdict of unlawful killing. The account does not contain the internal moments of the vehicle in the tunnel before the impact, because the person who was present in those moments describes those moments as the location where his memory does not go. The description may be accurate. The official examinations found it consistent with the available evidence. The adversarial examination of the inquest found it maintained across the most thorough public testing that any account of a witness's memory can receive in a formal legal setting. The consistency across those examinations is the strongest available evidence for the description's accuracy. The description may also be the description of a location where the memory goes, but is not being described as going. The description of available memory characterized as absent for reasons other than the neurological condition the description invokes. The official examinations found no evidence requiring this interpretation. The absence of evidence requiring the interpretation does not resolve the question of whether the interpretation is accurate. because the absence of evidence for a thing is not the same as the presence of evidence against it, and the question of what another person's memory contains is not a question that the absence of evidence for a particular answer resolves with the certainty that the question's significance demands. The gap remains. It has remained in the same location since the morning of the 31st of August 1997, when Rees-Jones first described it in the fragmentary terms that the immediate aftermath of the crash permit account, and by the specific emotional and psychological condition she was in when she was producing it. These shaping factors do not make the tapes unreliable as evidence of Diana's experience. They make them the specific kind of evidence that a retrospective personal account is, shaped by the factors that shape retrospective personal accounts, and possessing the authority and the limitations that the specific character of that kind of evidence produces. The tapes are the richest and most comprehensive primary source available for Diana's private experience in the years they cover, and the public record of Diana's private life is built substantially around the account they provide. The account they cannot provide is the account of Diana's private experience as it was occurring at the time, in the forms that the people who were present when it was occurring would have provided from their position of direct witness. The tapes are Diana's account of what she experienced. The direct witness account would be the account of what the people who were present when she was experiencing it observed from their positions of continuous presence in the environment where the experience was occurring. The two kinds of account are different in ways that matter for the completeness of the public record's available account of Diana's private life. The difference is the difference that this account identified in the second part's examination of what Mannakee's presence in Diana's environment produced in terms of knowledge of her experience. The difference between the account and the witness. Diana gave Morton the account. The witnesses are not in the public record in the direct form of their witnessing, because the direct form of the witnessing is in the gaps that death and the review process and the obligation structure and the Paris gaps described memory absence have produced in the public record's available account. What those gaps together contain, assembled from the reconstruction that the available evidence allows, and the specific examination of each gap's character that the preceding parts of this account have conducted, is the content of the public account's most significant incompleteness. The incompleteness is not uniform across the different dimensions of the public account. It is concentrated in specific areas where the protection officer's continuous presence in the private environment of the protection role and their personal relationships with Diana, in the cases where the personal dimension of the relationship developed, produced knowledge that is more specific and more directly observational than any other form of knowledge about Diana's private experience that the public account draws on. The most specific and most directly observational form of knowledge about a person's private experience is the knowledge of someone who was present when the experience was occurring, in the continuous form of presence that the protection role required, and in the personal form of relationship that Diana's management of the protection officers she trusted produced. The Morton tapes are the most primary of the available sources. The direct witness accounts of the people who were present in the continuous form and the personal form are the sources that would be more primary still if those accounts were in the public record rather than in the gaps that the management mechanisms have produced. They are not in the public record in that most primary form. The cleared publications and the public appearances and the family's accounts from adjacent positions are what the public record contains from the protection officers and the people closest to them. The most primary form is in the gaps, and the gaps are where this account has been, across its preceding parts, examining what the most primary form would have contained and what the public record's available account is missing, because the most primary form is in the gaps rather than in the available account. The specific content of the most primary form's absence from the public account is the content that the gaps cover, assembled from the reconstruction that the available evidence allows. The reconstruction produces a picture of what the protection officers knew across the years of their assignments with Diana, a picture assembled from the intersection of what Diana said on the tapes about the period each assignment covered and what the continuous professional and personal presence of the protection role in the environment of those periods would have produced in someone in the officer's specific positions. The picture is the picture of knowledge more specific and more directly observational than the public account contains about Diana's private experience in the same periods. It is the knowledge of the self-harm specific incidents in the specific terms of direct observation by people who were present when the incidents occurred, rather than the knowledge of the self-harm's general occurrence in the retrospective terms of Diana's own account of the experiences 4 years after some of them occurred. It is the knowledge of the bulimia's daily expression in the specific terms of someone present in the domestic environment, where the expression was a daily feature, rather than the knowledge of the bulimia's existence in the general terms that the cleared publications and the biographies have addressed. It is the knowledge of the marriage's private condition in the specific terms of the daily domestic environment that the continuous presence in that environment produced, rather than the knowledge of the marriage's private condition in the retrospective and necessarily selective terms of the accounts assembled from multiple sources at temporal remove from the events the accounts describe. It is the knowledge of Charles's emotional withdrawal from the marriage in the specific terms of what the withdrawal looked like in the daily domestic environment of the residences where both of them were present, rather than the knowledge of the withdrawal in the general terms that the biography's assembled accounts have provided. It is the knowledge of Diana's psychological condition in the daily operational terms of someone whose professional role required continuous engagement with that condition as the primary variable in the threat assessment the protection work was addressing, rather than the knowledge of the psychological condition in the terms of the periodic assessments and the documentary accounts and the retrospective descriptions that constitute the public record's available account. The specific form of the knowledge is more immediate, more specific, and more directly rooted in the primary evidence of direct observation than any other form of knowledge about Diana's private life that the public account draws on. Its absence from the public account is the absence of the most primary form of evidence for the private life that the public account is built from less primary forms of evidence to describe. The less primary forms are substantial. They are the forms that have produced the public account that exists, the account that has been built from Diana's own retrospective disclosures, and the cleared publications, and the biographies, and the journalistic investigations, and the legal proceedings, and the official investigations. The account built from those forms is the richest available public account of the private life of someone who occupied the position Diana occupied in the period she occupied it. The account built from those forms is also the account of someone whose private life was one of the most extensively managed against public visibility of any private life in the modern era, in the specific sense that the institutional management apparatus of the British royal family applied its most sophisticated communications management to the prevention of the private reality from entering the public record in forms that contradicted the managed public presentation. The account built from the available sources is the account that the management was not fully able to prevent from forming, assembled from the sources that escaped the management's reach and from the sources the management partially shaped. The most primary form of knowledge that the management most thoroughly prevented from reaching the public account is the knowledge of the protection officers in the direct witness form that their continuous presence in Diana's private environment produced. The management's prevention of that knowledge from reaching the public account in its most primary form is the management's most significant achievement in the specific terms of what the management has removed from the public record's available account of Diana's private life. The achievement is significant in the specific terms of what the most primary form of the knowledge would have added to the available account, if the management had not produced the gaps that prevent the most primary form from being in the available account. What it would have added is the specific and directly observational evidence for the private life's specific content that the available account assembles from less primary forms, the evidence that would have confirmed and extended, and in some dimensions corrected, the available account in the specific ways that the most directly observational evidence confirms and extends and corrects the accounts assembled from less directly observational sources. The confirmation and extension and correction that the most primary form of the knowledge would have provided for the available account are not recoverable in the specific terms that the direct witness accounts would have provided, because the direct witness accounts are in the gaps rather than in the available account. They are recoverable in the general terms of the reconstruction that the available evidence allows, the reconstruction that assembles the general shape of what the direct witness accounts would have contained from the intersection of the available source's account of the period, and the specific character of the protection role's presence in that period. The reconstruction is what this account has been assembling across its preceding parts. The reconstruction tells the general shape. The specific content of the direct witness accounts is in the gaps. The gaps are the permanent condition of the public record's available account of Diana's private life in the specific areas where the protection officer's continuous presence in that life produced the most primary form of knowledge of it. The Mannakee gap is the most complete of the gaps, the gap produced by the most complete of the management mechanisms available to the institutional management of the protection officer's knowledge. Death. The completeness of the Mannakee gap is the completeness that distinguishes it from the other gaps the account has examined, the completeness that makes it the center of the title's claim that the bodyguard took everything to his grave. What everything was, across the preceding parts of this account's reconstruction, is the knowledge of Diana's private life in the years between approximately 1985 and the spring of 1987, in the most primary and most directly observational form available for those years, accumulated by a person who was continuously present in Diana's private environment across those years in the operational form of the protection role's continuous coverage, and in the personal form of a relationship whose emotional significance Diana described on the Morton tapes in terms that make clear the relationship was one of the most significant of the years it covered. The everything that the grave received was this knowledge in this form across those years. The grave received it on the 5th of May 1987, when the accident on the A118 in East London terminated the person who held it, 6 weeks after the institutional transfer had terminated the operational access that was producing its ongoing accumulation. What the public never knew because the grave received what it received is the specific content of the most primary form of knowledge of Diana's private life in those years. The public never knew the specific incidents of the self-harm in the specific terms of the direct witness's observation of the incidents, because the direct witness died before the incidents could be described in those terms by the person who had observed them. The public never knew the specific texture of Diana's daily psychological condition in those years, in the terms of the daily operational observation of someone whose protection role required continuous engagement with that condition, because the person whose daily observation accumulated across 2 years of continuous presence took the daily observation into the ground on the 5th of May 1987. The public never knew what Diana told Mannakee directly in the years of the relationship's active duration, in the specific terms of what a person of the relationship's emotional significance told a trusted person in the private hours of a failing marriage, inside an institution that was providing no other adequate outlet for the truth of her experience. The tapes tell what Diana experienced. They do not tell what she said to Mannakee about what she was experiencing, because Mannakee is not on the tapes. The tapes are Diana's retrospective account. What she told Mannakee was the direct communication of a person telling another person the truth in real time, and the real-time communication is the communication that the grave received. These are specific and significant pieces of the most primary form of evidence for Diana's private life that are not in the public record. They are not in the public record because the management mechanisms that the preceding parts of this account have described produced the gaps that remove them from the public record's available account. The Mannakee gap is the most complete removal. The Wharfe gap is the most formally documented partial removal. The majority's silence is the most extensive aggregate removal. The Paris gap is the most specifically examined and least resolved removal. Together the gaps constitute the shape of what the public account of Diana's private life does not contain, the shape of the knowledge that the most directly observational witnesses to the different dimensions of that life accumulated in their different positions across the different years of their assignments and their presence in the events the account is built around. The shape is visible from the public record's available account in the specific form of the gap between what the account contains and what the most directly observational witnesses' accounts of the same period and events would have contained, assembled from the reconstruction that the available evidence allows. The gap between the available account and the most directly observational witnesses' accounts is the gap that the management mechanisms produced across the full extent of the protection officer's accumulated knowledge of Diana's private life and public death. The production of the gap was the management's objective across the full period of its operation, from the review processes applied to the cleared publications, to the obligation structure's management of the default condition of the protection officer's silence, to the death that produced the Mannakee gap's completeness, and the described memory absence that produces the Paris gap's persistence. The objective was the management of what the most directly observational witnesses to Diana's private life knew, and what the public record would receive from that knowledge, in the direction of the institutional management apparatus's preferred account, rather than in the direction of the most directly observational account that the witness's knowledge would have produced without the management's operation. The preferred account is the official account, the account of Diana's private life assembled from the sources the management apparatus's preferred version of the record draws on. The most directly observational account is the account of the witness's knowledge in the most primary form, the form that the management mechanisms have prevented from being in the public record, in the direct form that the witness's continuous presence in Diana's private environment would have produced. The public never knew the most directly observational account. The public received the available account, assembled from the sources that the management did not fully prevent from reaching the public record. The available account is substantial and is the richest account of Diana's private life that the management's partial success in containing the most directly observational form has permitted to reach the public. It is not the most complete account possible. The most complete account would be the account that included the most directly observational witness's knowledge in the most primary form, the knowledge of continuous presence in Diana's private environment across the years of the different assignments and the events of that night in Paris. The most complete account is the account that the gaps prevent from existing in the public record. The gaps are permanent in the specific forms that the different mechanisms producing them have made permanent. The Mannakee gap is permanent because death is permanent. The Wharfe gap is permanent in its cleared form because the review process's determination of what the cleared publication contains is the determination of record rather than a determination available for revision in the normal course of the cleared publication's ongoing existence as a public document. The majority's silence is permanent in the sense that the obligation structure's management of the default condition is a permanent feature of the institutional landscape for the majority of the people whose silence it maintains. The Paris gap is permanent in the sense that the described memory absence has been described consistently since the morning of the 31st of August, 1997, and has not changed across every formal and informal examination of it that the intervening period has produced. The permanence of the gaps is the permanence of what the public account of Diana's private life and public death does not contain. The permanence is the permanent condition of the public record's incompleteness in the specific areas where the protection officer's most directly observational knowledge of Diana's private environment produced the most primary form of evidence for what that environment contained. The public never knew what was in those areas of the public record in the most directly observational form. The public knew what the available account contained, assembled from the less primary forms that the management did not fully prevent from reaching the record. The less primary forms are the forms the public record has, and the public record's account is the account those forms have produced. It is the richest available account of a private life whose most directly observational witnesses were managed, across the full period of the management's operation, toward the gaps that the management's objective required them to be managed toward. The management's objective was the management of the most directly observational knowledge in the direction of the gaps, rather than in the direction of the public record's available account. The management produced the gaps. The gaps are permanent. The public account is the account that the permanent gaps do not contain. Diana is the voice in the tapes, describing her experience in the retrospective terms that the 4 years between the experience and the tapes allowed, and in the terms she chose for the description. The tapes are the most primary form of the available account. They are the account that the management could not prevent from forming because Diana found the mechanism that was outside the management's reach. Mannakee is the absence at the center of the available account's most significant incompleteness. He was the person whose continuous presence in Diana's private environment across the years of the marriage's worst deterioration produced the most directly observational knowledge of what the years contained, in the personal form of a relationship whose emotional significance gave the observational knowledge the additional dimension of direct communication between two people in genuine emotional engagement with each other's reality. He is not in the public record. He is in the grave. He has been in the grave since the 5th of May 1987, and the grave has not given back what it received. The account he could have provided of the years he witnessed in the most directly observational form is the account that would have been most primary after Diana's own account, and that would have confirmed and extended and in specific dimensions provided what Diana's retrospective account could not provide, the account of the experience from the position of the witness who was there when the experience was occurring. The witness who was there when the experience was occurring is the witness who took what they knew to the grave. The grave has kept it. The public account has everything else. Everything else is what the available evidence allows to be assembled from the sources the management did not prevent from reaching the record. It is substantial. It is the richest available account of one of the most publicly visible private lives of the 20th century's final decades. It is not what it would have been if the most directly observational witnesses had been free to provide their accounts in the most primary form that their continuous presence in Diana's private environment had produced. The difference between what the public account is and what it would have been is the difference that the gaps contain. The gaps are the permanent condition of the public record's account of Diana's private life and public death. The gaps are what the management produced and what the management has maintained across the decades since the mechanisms that produced the gaps were deployed. The management produced the gaps. The gaps contain what the public never knew. What the public never knew is the direct witness knowledge of Diana's private life in the most primary form, that the continuous presence of the protection role in that life accumulated across the years of the different assignments and across the events of the night the assignments were ultimately protecting her against. The protection failed in the tunnel. The knowledge it had accumulated survived the failure in the gaps. The gaps are permanent. What they contain is permanent too. It is just permanent in the form of the absence, rather than permanent in the form of the account. The absence is what the bodyguard took to his grave. The grave has kept every word of it. Barry Mannakee was buried in May 1987. He was 39 years old. The people who came to the funeral knew him as a father and a colleague and a metropolitan police officer whose career had included an assignment that the institutional management of the circumstances surrounding that assignment had concluded required his removal 6 weeks before his death. What he knew when he was buried was what 2 years of continuous presence in Diana's private environment had produced in him, combined with the specific additional dimension of what the relationship of genuine emotional significance that Diana described on the Morton tapes 4 years later had made directly available to him through the trust that the relationship permitted. The self-harm and the bulimia and the marriage's specific private condition and the daily texture of a woman's psychological crisis in the years the assignment covered, in the most directly observational form that continuous professional presence, combined with personal trust, produces in someone occupying the position he had occupied. None of it came out of the grave. The grave received it, and the grave kept it, and the public account of Diana's private life has been assembled without it from the less primary forms that the management did not prevent from reaching the record. Diana placed on the Morton tapes everything she could place there. She described what she had experienced in the retrospective terms of someone who had found the one mechanism outside the institutional management's reach and was using it to place the truth of her experience into a form that would survive the management's preference for its non-preservation. The tapes are the most primary form in the available account. They are the account that the management could not prevent. What the management could prevent was the most directly observational account of the same experiences from the people who were present in the environment where the experiences were occurring when they occurred. The mechanisms available to the management for that prevention were the mechanisms this account has described across its 7 parts. Death in the most complete case, review processes in the partial cases, the obligation structures management of the default silence in the majority of the cases, the described memory absence in the Paris case. The mechanisms produced the gaps. The gaps are permanent. The public account of Diana's private life contains what the management's partial failure to prevent the available sources from reaching the record allowed the available account to contain. It does not contain what the management's partial success in producing the gaps removed from the record. The most complete removal was Mannakee. The most complete gap is the one he produced by taking everything into the ground on the 5th of May 1987. Diana is on the tapes, describing the years he witnessed. He is in the grave, having witnessed them. The account and the witness are permanently separated. The tape runs. The grave is silent. The gap between them is where the most primary form of the truth about those years has always lived, and where it will remain for as long as the grave keeps what it was given. It has kept it for nearly 4 decades. There is no indication that it intends to stop. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.